All right, welcome all, and thank you for your attendance. My name is Dr. Zachary Beier. I'm the current president of the Archaeological Society of Jamaica and the lecturer in archaeology at the University of the West Indies, Mona, in the Department of History and Archaeology. I've got moderating duties today, along with the assistance of our other executive board members of the ASJ. So just to begin, I want to thank the ASJ board who have made this event possible. Today, this is our second installment of our virtual webinar series. We're focusing on plantation archaeology in Jamaica and the role of the plantation in shaping some of the complex colonial transformations that continue to structure life in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. This first part is on plantation archaeology. We're going to have more parts, but we're focused today on the Parish of Trelawny. And Trelawny Parish is particularly significant for Jamaican plantation archaeology. You're going to see some of these case studies today, but the parish itself, formed in 1770, was a result of plantation interests, the desire of these wealthy planters to be closer and more in charge of their administrative center. Trelawny, based on the research by former UE historian Barry Higman, at some of the highest numbers of sugar estates and plantation populations throughout the 19th century. It also is closely linked to the development of what is now a modern heritage attraction in the Heritage District of Falmouth, as well as being dotted by large maroon settlements, which all are impacting operations and daily life within this area of plantation Jamaica. But I should say, in terms of our focus on plantation archaeology and its relevance in contemporary Jamaican society, I would be remiss not to highlight the feedback that we received on social media over the last week or so regarding the lack of Black Jamaican archaeologists on this panel. The presentation, promotion, protection of Jamaican archaeology, that's been the ASJ's mandate for quite a while, since 1965. We've been involved in presentations for many years. I've only been involved since 2014. These are annual symposiums. These have been going on for a decade or more. And we identify relevant topics and we place them within particular regions and sites in Jamaica. Certainly in our recent process, we came up short identifying Black archaeologists carrying out active research at Jamaican plantations. The history of our society, the ASJ, Jamaican archaeology, and global archaeological research more generally are wrapped up in this longer legacy of whiteness in archaeology, which has resulted in some deep racial disparities and underrepresentation, especially when we look at who's researching topics like colonialism, transatlantic slavery, African slavery, as well as racism in the Caribbean. I'll say, as the current president, this is a serious issue, but one the ASJ is going to embrace and use as an opportunity to continue demonstrating the value of Jamaican archaeology, continue to engage with local, regional, and international audiences, but most certainly create a space, representative space, and one that we can focus on the continued development of professional practice in Jamaica and wider Caribbean archaeology. So thank you for your attendance. Thank you everyone who's provided feedback or suggestions on how we can move forward. We look forward to future events and your continued feedback. I'll just conclude and I've posted in the chat, we've got some rules of the road there. I just want to encourage everyone to introduce yourself, provide your affiliation in the chat. And for the time being, please keep yourself muted. Feel free to ask questions in the chat or hold your questions, comments into the end, and you can take over the mic. And if you're using social media, please, if you can use the hashtags ASJ Webinar, Archaeology Jamaica to track your comments, we'd really appreciate it. So let's move forward. I want to bring thanks from the ASJ board to all our contributors, our audience. I have the pleasure of introducing the chair of our session, my dear friend, Dr. Susan Francis Brown, who will provide introduction, conclusion, as well as introduce our panelists. But before I hand off, I just want to say a bit about Dr. Francis Brown. She is a curator and historian. She's also our immediate past president of the ASJ. She's worked at as a site historian on archaeological surveys at the UE campus, so Pepin and Mona Estates in St. Andrew Parish. She's also worked closely alongside the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, and we've got Dr. Jillian Galle today, who leads that initiative. Suzanne was a fellow of the International Center for Jefferson Studies and an archaeological researcher on the DAX ISM Southampton collaboration, the St. Kitts Nevis Digital Archaeology Initiative. She also authored a book that's very near and dear to my heart, and anyone that has gone to UE or is interested in UE or is studying plantations in Jamaica, and that's Mona, Past and Present, the History and Heritage of the UE Mona, and that was published in 2004. She's worked on heritage interpretation. She's authored articles on families enslaved on those two estates, Mona and Pepin, as well as more generally on enslaved runaways in Jamaica. She was the curator of the UE Museum and its founder beginning in 2012 until 2019. And her work also extends beyond plantations into World War II camps in Jamaica, which I've had the pleasure to collaborate with her on that research, as well as architectural history. So all yours, Dr. Francis Brown, and thank you for chairing this session.
Thank you, Zach. Good morning, everybody. Great to have you all join us. My brief remarks will overlap a little with some of what Zach has said. I think he's referred to a number of things that are quite important. One of the things that struck me most when the ASJ decided to do this second part of the webinar series focusing on plantation archaeology, which is very, very important from my perspective, is that there are very few archaeologists working actively in Jamaica. Many of those are with the Jamaica National Heritage Trust or at the University of the West Indies. And as a consequence, looking in particular at the plantation archaeology, much of the material that we have access to has in fact come from academic researchers from various universities and other agencies in the United States and other parts of the world. And I think that one of the things that it's been important for ASJ to do is to try and draw together a lot of that material so that persons, researchers in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, and beyond can have a sense of what is out there, whether to recognize and to be aware of what is being done, or to identify gaps perhaps in that research or left by that research. But really to have some kind of a baseline. I think it's become particularly important in view of development efforts, development initiatives that are taking place in Jamaica, especially on the North Coast. And certainly at Stewart Castle, one of the estates that's going to be talked about today, that is a distinct challenge, and I think more of a challenge for the sections of the estate that relate to the enslaved population than perhaps that relates to the owners of those estates. So I think the fact that research has been done in the past and that we're becoming aware of that research, that material, is of particular importance. And I think it's wonderful that the ASJ is pulling this together so that we can have that opportunity. And it's great to become more familiar with the persons and the research that has been done. I think one of the other things, sorry, my notes are, if I showed them to you, they're in an awful condition. Yeah, I think that one of the things that Zach mentioned was the Parish of Trelawny. And for me, the fact that we're looking thematically at this parish, which was from its inception in 1770, was one of the most important for the sugar economy of the region. Zach mentioned that some of the highest number of sugar estates in the island at one point was in the Parish of Trelawny. The parish named after the then governor of the island when the parish was split off from St. James, which was administratively just too large. And Trelawny starts, and it originally has its capital at Martha Brae, and that finally moves down to Falmouth, and that's where a lot of the export and so on is taking place. And some of the richest sugar estate owners in the island actually are in Trelawny, people like John Tharp, who own the Good Hope estate, which is one of the ones that we're going to be focusing on today. And so we're going to be looking at 3 estates within that Parish of Trelawny. And one of the things I'm hoping will come out of it is that we can not only look at the work that has been done by Hayden and Rich and Sean and Jillian, but also perhaps begin to draw out some of the threads that connect those efforts that they have had, and some of the context that relates to the Parish of Trelawny, but really also to the island as a whole and beyond, because Jamaica in the 18th and 19th centuries was of international significance, certainly in the Atlantic world. I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing all of our presenters. What I'm going to do is to introduce them ahead of their own presentation so that we'll have fresh in our minds who it is that is presenting and what they're presenting on. So we're going to go in the order of Hayden Bassett, then Rich Veit, and then Sean Devlin and Jillian Galle, who are going to be coming together on Stuart Castle. So let me start by introducing Dr. Hayden Bassett of the Virginia Museum of Natural History, Virginia, USA, and who has done work on Good Hope. He's the Assistant Curator of Archaeology at the Virginia Museum of Natural History, where he directs the state of Virginia's Archaeological Research Lab. Dr. Bassett also serves as an affiliated scholar at the College of William and Mary and a research associate at the Smithsonian Institute. From 2010 to 2016, he conducted archaeological fieldwork in Trelawny, Jamaica, including excavations at Good Hope Estate and the Foundry site and the Tharp House in Falmouth. Today, he remains involved in historic preservation in Jamaica as the Vice President of the Board of Directors for Falmouth Heritage Renewal, and continues his research on Northern Jamaica's plantation landscape. Hayden is going to be speaking on the topic which I have. This is really ridiculous. Community and colonial infrastructures in Plantation, Jamaica, an archaeological view from Good Hope Estate. So let me pass over to Hayden.
All right, thank you so much. And let me try to get the screen share up again. There we go, and screen. All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so thank you so much for having me present here today. I'm pretty excited to present some of these ideas, just because for some of them, it's the first place I've been able to present them kind of in a public forum. And so with that, you know, as was introduced, this is archaeological work that I did largely for my dissertation research between 2013 and 2016. And it did focus on Good Hope Estate and sort of the larger John Tharp network of plantations in Trelawny, extending all the way to Falmouth, Jamaica itself. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And so I should begin by saying that this work is really the product of the Good Hope Archaeological project. And the Good Hope Archaeological project, again, was designed around, for me, it was kind of a dissertation project, but I wanted it to be more than that. I wanted it to be kind of a professional project in Jamaica, and something that kind of goes beyond the field school, goes beyond the sort of training and experience that really was, that fills a gap, which contributes towards the professionalization of archaeology in Jamaica. And to do that, I wanted to devote every single year most of the project budget to actual paid positions for Jamaican archaeologists. And you can see a very esteemed group of folks here that are part of the Good Hope Archaeological Project team. Clive Gray, I believe, is on the call today. I saw him on there. Ashley might be on here. I saw her in the email, but I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Iva Connelly, who really helped me accomplish this, because he's the one who was able to put me in touch with these archaeologists right here year after year, and really build an infrastructure that allowed me to do this project in the way that we did. So I'll go ahead and continue with that and just kind of give you a background first on Good Hope. So Good Hope is located in Trelawny on the Martha Brae River. It is not just sort of, I don't like to think of it as just sort of an isolated plantation out there, but rather it's kind of the head seat of a network of 9 to 10 plantations, all owned by John Tharp, who's pictured here. John Tharp was born in Jamaica, educated in England, came back to Jamaica, and for most of his time here, he was a resident proprietor, unlike many plantation owners at the time. There was a brief time when he was in England. But that's sort of important for thinking about the plantation landscape here, just because this isn't sort of, there's a lot of things involved in absentee ownership that aren't necessarily going on here. But Good Hope Estate was an incredibly large and profitable enterprise for John Tharp. But that was built on sort of the labor of upwards between 380 and 500 enslaved individuals at any one time between the 1760s and the opening years of the 19th century. A lot of the records we have for Good Hope come from between 1802 and 1804. It was around the time of John Tharp's death. And this comes from the estate inventories, some of the records that still survive today in Cambridge, that really detail how the plantation worked. And so a view of Good Hope. Good Hope is about 2,000 acres in total. The plantations you see sort of labeled on this slide, Wales, Lansquenet, Covey, and Golden Grove, are all owned by John Tharp. And so when I said that this is kind of a network of Tharp estates, more so than an isolated plantation, you can kind of see how that worked. Good Hope's kind of square in the middle of all of them, and served as a place where a lot of the infrastructure for this plantation network was concentrated. So enslaved people constantly moved back and forth between these estates on any given construction campaign or labor needs or anything like that. But you can see, Good Hope is kind of your typical Jamaican estate in its layout, sugar estate in its layout. You have a radial plan around a production complex. In this case, the production complex is centered on the Martha Brae River. It's that sort of concentration of buildings you see in the center of the estate. And a lot of that's because of that's where the water mill was located. And so the radial arrangement, as many people on this call know, is focused on productive flows from the estate outlying fields to the production center in order to get the cane from the field to the mill as quickly as possible. But you'll see that it's not just the production buildings in this view of the estate, but you can also begin to see where a lot of the people of Good Hope were living and laboring. And a lot of that comes from, again, some of the good records that we have for Good Hope. This is one of them. This is from a close-up view of an estate map, a state plat of Good Hope from the year 1794, and it was drawn by John Henry Schroeder, who was a military engineer stationed in Falmouth at the time. So incredibly accurate, which is really a gold mine for the archaeological work today, because it really helped guide us in understanding where people were living, where people were working, and what the different components of the estate were in 1794 and how they all fit together. And as you can see, one of the most important inclusions on this estate plat was the village, the slave village, here labeled Negro houses. Now, I should say that, based on our archaeological work, which you'll see in a second, we do think that this is largely a stylized depiction of the village. So where the houses are located on here is not actually where the houses were located. But I should say it's important to note how how Schroeder chose to illustrate kind of the individual components of the village. So if you look closely, you're going to see 3 or 4 different things, that are replicated over and over again. And that's going to be the house itself. There's going to be a small sort of garden next to the house, and then small walls surrounding individual houses and garden complexes. And then, of course, underneath, lots of trees. And we'll go. Now, fortunately for Good Hope, we have, again, excellent records. One of those being the inventories conducted upon Tharp's death in 1804 that include, in this case, 384 enslaved people living on the estate at the time, living and laboring on the estate, and they're listed by name, age, a category, they called country here, which is kind of their, what they determined to be their origin, the inventoriers, as well as occupation and their assessed value. So there's a lot of important information in here, particularly in allowing us to understand what labor looked like at Good Hope. And so here is a list of all of the occupation categories, enslaved occupation categories that are in that inventory. And you can see that, pretty much everything that you can imagine would be covered in a dedicated enslaved occupation. So I'll just let you look through that real quick. And I should say that, the one maybe interesting thing in here is the wharfinger and the wharf laborer and the waiting boy. Those were actually, they're listed as resident at Good Hope, but we believe that they're actually working at the Tharp house down in Falmouth at Tharp's wharf down there. Beyond that, the fisherman is actually a fisherwoman. We know that from the name. And she is tending the fish pond behind the Great House at Good Hope, as is the fowl keeper. But everything else, I believe, is somewhat self-explanatory in here. So, and the good thing about these records is not only do they give us a picture of what labor looked like, but as we go through Good Hope today and see some of the remains of these plantation buildings, it not only allows us to identify what the buildings were, but it allows us to populate those buildings, not only with, the occupations that were there, but actually the named individuals that were there. So here's a good example from the Good Hope Hospital. You can see the 9 enslaved individuals that were assigned and forced to work in this location, including an enslaved doctor named George. But this is just one example of a many at Good Hope, and this ability to name people who worked here is going to come back later. So just keep that in your mind. But with that, I kind of want to get started with the first part of this presentation, and there's going to be 2 parts. So part 1, community infrastructure, and then there's going to be a part 2 on colonial infrastructures. So part 1 focuses on domestic space, and that really is the village itself at Good Hope. So with this, our question was, a research question. In what ways did enslaved people organize themselves in plantation villages? What institutions did they create to negotiate enslavement? And are enslaved communities, in fact, characterized by community-level organization? And you'll see why that's important in a second. But to do that, we did kind of an approach that's going to be familiar, and I think you'll see over and over again today in this presentation, because I will say it is pioneered in my view by the DAX folks. And so this began as a DAX research consortium project. So Jillian and Fraser and the team were kind enough to allow me to come on board as in the DAX Research Consortium, and provided some generous funding for the first field season in this in 2014. And what that looked like was a shovel test pit survey across one section of the village. And you can see up in the corner up there, I have the STP survey superimposed on top of that 1794 plat to give you an idea of what this coverage looked like. But beyond the STPs themselves, the shovel test pits, this also included 4 1-by-1 meter units carefully excavated for stratigraphic control. And so what did those look like? For folks who've worked on plantation contexts in Jamaica, this is going to be a very familiar assemblage to you. So this is the domestic assemblage that's represented in a typical STP that we found. We did 184 shovel test pits, and a lot of them looked like this, a mixture of domestic material, your ceramics, a lot of architectural remains, as well as some very utilitarian items, a lot of barrel straps, that type of deal. And so what did that allow us to do? So the step one in this project was really, in our view, community driven. And so each year, I want to sort of recognize Mr. Kevon Harding, who was my primary collaborator and who I know many of you know and have worked with, and I believe has presented several times to the ASJ. But Mr. Kevon Harding and I really wanted to understand what did the community of Falmouth want to know about Good Hope at the time. And so our main forum for that was every year, every field season, we'd present our findings at the public library in Falmouth. And that was an opportunity to sort of solicit folks in the communities, their questions, their interests in this. And what we found was that one of the main questions, very simple, one of the main questions that people wanted to know was just really, what did life look like? So it was less sort of, our interests in the social theory and sort of the more academic side of things, and more just the basic questions that still need to be answered. And this is, what did domestic life look like in these villages? What was life like for an enslaved person at Good Hope in the 18th and 19th century? And this was a question that we could really answer with the archaeology. So we considered this our step one. And so that included reconstructing the subsistence, how people ate, how people cooked, and how people had to sustain themselves. And also sort of the activities beyond formal labor. What did people do outside of their assigned labor tasks? So for some of that included physical reconstruction of the spaces at Good Hope. So as many of you know on this call, and many of you have been there, Good Hope is a modern day sort of, is a part of the tourist industry. It's kind of a combined heritage tourism and outdoor recreational tourism facility today. And so what we wanted to do with this is really contribute to the heritage tourism side of this by not just showing the plantation buildings, the production of sugar and rum, and the sort of world of John Tharp. We wanted to show what life was like for enslaved people. So our role in that was to use the archaeology, again, in this step one, to actually physically reconstruct some of the spaces up there. And this is the one dwelling that we reconstructed based on the archaeological evidence. And when I say we, I mean the folks with Falmouth Heritage Renewal. So the landowner Blaze Hart was kind enough to fund this project in constructing not only the house, but if you look closely, kind of what the immediate surroundings of the house would look like too, with a walled yard, swept yard. In this case, this is right when we were constructing it, so it's the yard hasn't been trampled and swept enough to really show it. But this is kind of our basic domestic unit that we could determine from the archaeology. Now, beyond that, Mr. Kevon Harding again. Today, Kevon is a professional architect practicing, award-winning professional architect practicing in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So all of the illustrations that I'm getting ready to show you are not my doing, it is certainly his doing. So from the archaeology, we wanted to sort of build from the ground up. And so this is what this kind of looked like. So we started with, raising those foundations into physical houses, raising those walls and wall foundations into walls. And then from that, actually illustrating these spaces based on the archaeology. And so Kevon and I worked together and pinpointed every single activity area we could in the archaeological record, every detail down to the architectural remains in the archaeology, the yard spaces, anything we could find to really reconstruct and populate this space. So it's not just sort of a detached sort of site plan of an archaeological area, but it was actually, people could really wrap their heads around, what were we seeing in the archaeology? What did domestic life look like? And so here is kind of just a basic view of, some of the ideas that we were really able to develop from this process. Here's another view of one of Kevon's illustrations based on our archaeological findings. And as you can see, I like to point out, we were able to find these yard spaces, particularly through the swept yard spaces. In the center of them, we found very visible, archaeologically visible cooking remains, hearths, ceramics, iron pots. And I like to always point out, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but if you can, in the center right there, we have a cat depicted right here. And that's partially because we did find a cat mandible when we were excavating in this yard right here. But I will return to this image shortly. And so step 2 was kind of our research. Beyond the reconstruction of life at Good Hope, we wanted to answer our question, which our research question was looking at community as a social process. So not necessarily as community in terms of identity, but community as a social process. And what I mean by that is I'll just sort of give you this definition, is community is an ever-emergent social institution that generates and is generated by supra-household, that's important, supra-household interactions that are structured and synchronized by a set of places within a particular span of time. Daily interactions rely on and in turn develop shared premises or understandings, which can be modalized in the development of common community identities. So the key words in here are going to be that supra-household interaction. So community as defined by multiple households interacting with each other, forming some type of social recognition on that village scale. And so what was our approach to answering this question? So I'll give you kind of 2 answers to that. So one of the ways that we did that was looking at artifact distributions, kind of a first step that I think most archaeologists will take in this case. And here's just 3 distributions I wanted to highlight in particular. Now, when I say distributions, I mean on an X, Y, so just spatial horizontal distributions. So tablewares, teawares, and refined chamber pots. That's an odd assemblage of items, but that'll make sense in a second. So I wanted to show here that tablewares, these are your basic everyday plates and bowls used, just in eating in domestic context. These are somewhat uniform across the village. We see these across every household. These are not excluded to a few, but are largely shared among many. To the contrary, and as expected, teawares and refined chamber pots are somewhat specialized and costly and high status goods. And so, as we would expect, those are somewhat concentrated. But the 2D view of this, so the spatial view of this, tells one story. But the really interesting part in my mind in answering these sort of community questions was when we looked at it on in another distribution, so the vertical distribution. So that's what I have illustrated here is the Z value. So what you're looking at in this graph is the distribution of those costlier items in terms of elevation rather than in terms of horizontal distribution. And as you can see, we have 3 houses shown here on one of our transects. These are houses where we actually found the foundations of them in the survey. And the interesting part about this is that, as I showed in the previous image, tablewares are uniform across this space. But teawares and refined chamber pots, again, costlier, more exclusive items, are very much concentrated. And they're very much concentrated in certain areas. And we found this replicated over and over in the village. And I went into this thinking one thing. What I thought was I was going to find the high status goods at the highest elevation, kind of a very simplistic, idea of status in these contexts. But I found something very different. I found that it was actually the flattest terrain, so the least slope, where we found the concentrations of T-wares and refined chamber pots. And this was, again, I want to stress that this is not a colluvial process. So this is not the downward, washing of goods just onto the flat terrain, because again, we found tablewares uniformly distributed across. So what we are looking at is more of a social process rather than an environmental process. But I will say that it appears to be in a social appropriation of the environment in this case, in which the exclusive areas, so a process of land tenure seems to have been recognized in which status was correlated with flat usable terrain. So in other words, the lowest status individuals in terms of a material signature were on those dramatic slopes. The high status households seem to have been concentrated on the very finite amount of flat terrain within this bowl-shaped village. So what does this suggest? This suggests that we do have some form of inter-household recognition of status through land tenure, again, in which flat terrain is valued over higher elevation terrain and appropriated accordingly. So that gets us towards our research question in an interesting way. It indicates that, at least for land tenure, indications of community level social organization as defined by inter-household social practices and institutions at the village scale. And the interesting thing about this, I don't have enough time, unfortunately, to go into all of the other sort of lines of evidence on this today, but this seems to be just sort of one aspect and one archaeologically visible manifestation of community level social institutions created by enslaved people. And just to kind of give you a bullet list of other findings is, households appear to have formed in clusters or through the village, at least in the survey area, of 1 to 3 dwellings around shared yard space. We infer this to be kin groups. And so I should say that when I say kin groups, these can include both true and fictive kin groups in this context. But again, our finding is between 1 and 3 households. For some reason, it does not seem to extend beyond the sort of 3 household clusters around a shared yard. Again, desirable or flat land choices corresponded with shared yard clusters, while sloping terrain corresponded with isolated houses. And along those same lines, material wealth did not correlate with enslaved occupation. And you might be asking, well, how did you see that? Well, one way that we could see that is we actually had 2 villages, 2 segregated villages at Good Hope. One was reserved exclusively for the house domestics, and the other ones was for the rest of the enslaved population. And what we determined was we actually, again, totally contrary to expectations, we did not find the highest status material items in terms of, costly items in that domestic servants village. We actually found them in the main village. And we didn't just find them sort of spread across the main village. Again, we found them focused on those sort of flat areas that corresponded with these multi-dwelling household clusters. And so what can be inferred from that? And it suggests that kinship, again, these multi-dwelling households and kinship, and by extension, pooling of resources might have been one central way in which people negotiated the conditions of enslavement. Now, I want to kind of switch gears. Zach, how am I doing on time?
You're running out of it, but I want you to finish this. So give us part 2 in kind of the rapid fire mode, Hayden.
All right, that sounds
not
good.
to rush you though. This is yeah, a pleasure to listen to. Thank you.
All right, so part 2 is I want to sort of because it helps complement and help part 1. So I'm going to give you again, this will be a rapid fire part. So colonial infrastructure and roads, and this was a part of this research which we considered very important because it told sort of the other side of things. Enslaved life at Good Hope was not just sort of this, picturesque reconstruction of domestic life. It was, there were many harsh realities to enslaved life, something that we could also see in the archaeological record, and more on the landscape scale than in the domestic context. And so Rhodes was one avenue in which we saw that, so I'll kind of skip ahead. So this is a picture from that 1794 plat of Good Hope that shows you the scale and extent of the road network at Good Hope. I just want to say that roads, like buildings on a plantation, were a significant investment. And importantly, in terrains like sort of the edges of the cockpit country at Good Hope, mobility is limited. It's hard to move through a landscape without roads, and as such, roads determine the patterns of mobility because it's hard to deviate from those roads. And this led me to explore roads as a form of not only physical but social infrastructure. And when I say social infrastructure, I mean a form of extended control, the design and maintenance of which itinerated people in certain ways with respect to the plantation landscape. And so the starting place in all this is, an archaeology of infrastructures is really limited to reconstructing the movements of past bodies and motions through constraints on an otherwise free and accessible field of mobility. And our job as archaeologists is to reverse engineer these networks to understand the implications of structured mobility. And so to do that, I used space syntax. And so space syntax is, I want to just first recognize that this is a method that was first introduced to me from Fraser Nyman, who I think is on the call today. And so I wanted to use that method and look at it kind of in a different way on a plantation scale. So this is kind of a vector rendering of Good Hope Estate. And the type of space syntax I wanted to look at, which is really looking at the social implications of structured space, is called axial analysis, which is used today by architects to understand largely urban networks. And so what does this look like? So here's Good Hope. Again, here's the buildings, just to familiarize yourself. And when we look at space syntax, we can input our road networks and other spaces and output certain quantitative values which have meaning to us as archaeologists in terms of kind of the social implications of designed space. And two of those values are integration and connectivity. Integration is the overall sort of the score. You can think of it as this is the most integrated spaces on the plantation are going to be the most central and connected spaces on the plantation, in which anyone moving to or through Good Hope is going to have to pass. And you can kind of see that the production center, which is sort of highlighted here in values scored as red in the highest integration values, as predicted, is going to be the most integrated place on the plantation. The lowest areas are those peripheral spots. But when we look at this in terms of integration versus a measure we call connectivity, which is simply the number of roads that connect to a space, making it most accessible, we see something different. As you can see, the production center is the most integrated, but it's not the most connected. The connections to the space are actually one step removed from the production center. So in this case, I've labeled bottleneck A and bottleneck B. So before you get to the production center, you actually have deliberate, what appear to be designed bottlenecks. And importantly, these correspond with two buildings on the plantation. And so they're both the plantation's buildings directly associated with surveillance and control. One of them is the overseer's house. The other one is what we've called the outpost, which is a building that was inhabited by an enslaved watchman dedicated to monitoring these intersections. And so here's that bottleneck A, the overseer's house, and that bottleneck B, and you can see the outpost there. So this led us to a reconceptualization of plantation roads. And I wanted to highlight this image in one particular feature that you might have missed the first time around, and that's that plantation roads were not just a way of getting, from point A to point B, but they were a form of extended control in which a planter in managerial minority could exert their control over an enslaved majority. So that's always been a question in my mind is, at these ratios of, 10 to 1, how did people exert control over this enslaved population? And it's not just the buildings, it's not just, you know, the landscapes, but it's instruments like Plantation Roads that really helped accomplish that. And I'll just sort of, I want to end, since we're running out of time, I kind of want to end on, sorry, I'm in trouble with the slides. I want to end on this slide. So with this, you know, one of the questions that Zach posed to us today was, you know, looking forward, how does this archaeology contribute and is meaningful to contemporary Jamaica? And one of the ways that I wanted to just stress was that, you know, as we move forward with the heritage tourism industry in Jamaica and the stories that we tell through our archaeology, one thing I'd like to stress is that, you know, the physical manifestations of, you know, the heritage industry and archaeology today are incredibly important for what stories not only get told, but reinforced just in your daily movements through Jamaica. And things like, you know, repopulating the physical landscapes with these images of what life was like and these structures really helps to sort of, you know, renegotiate today's plantation landscape, which was largely designed to basically influence, you know, people moving through Jamaica, whether that's the roads themselves or the buildings, to display, you know, planters' wealth or to exert control over one's mobility. We can kind of combat that narrative today by kind of looking at reinforcing and building a new type of heritage tourism, and this is what, at least at Good Hope, we're trying to do with our physical reconstructions, but also our you know, populating of the landscape and the buildings with people's names and the visual renderings themselves from Kevon. So with that, I just want to thank a few folks and turn it over to the next presenter.
Thanks, Hayden. That was, all right, we leave the question. We leave the questions and comments until later, but thank you very, very much for that. I'm going to move along in view of our time constraints. I'm going to move along to Richard Veit. He is a PhD and professor of anthropology and dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Monmouth University. In 2007, he was the recipient of Monmouth University's Distinguished Teacher Award. He has authored or co-authored numerous articles and reviews and 7 books, including Digging New Jersey's Past, Historical Archaeology in the Garden State, 2002, New Jersey Cemeteries and Tombstones, History in the Landscape, co-authored with Mark. I'm going to do a really bad job of this. Nonesteed in 2008, and the Archaeology of American Cemeteries and Gravemakers, co-authored with Shireen Bauer of the University of Florida Press in 2016. He also regularly presents on topics related to historical archaeology and has been a TED Talk speaker. Rich is going to make a presentation that we were unfortunately unable to hear earlier this year at the normal ASJ annual symposium, where we had hoped that he would present. And it was a presentation to be made collaboratively with Nicola Kelly, Sean McHugh, and Timothy Dinsmore. And it is titled Not Unmindful of the Unfortunate, Giving Voice to the Forgotten Through Archaeology at the Orange Valley Slave Hospital. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen here. And hold on one second. Can everyone see that? Does that look all right? Give me a thumbs up. All right. Thank you so much for having me as part of this symposium today. So this presentation is titled, as you heard, Not Unmindful of the Unfortunate, Giving Voice to the Forgotten Through Archaeology at the Orange Valley Slave Hospital. And that title is based on a Latin inscription carved on a stone block set into the portico of this picturesque ruined slave hospital on the Orange Valley Plantation in Trelawny Parish, Jamaica. The building, which you see here, was constructed at the request of planter Herbert Newton Jarrett III in 1797. It's a massive physical reminder of the profound contradictions embodied by the debate over slavery and amelioration in the British Caribbean in the late 18th century. And since 2016, Monmouth University has been conducting excavations at the site dedicated to revealing this story. And I've had the honor and the pleasure of co-directing those excavations with my good colleague, Nikki Kelly, who's also on today's Zoom. The history of the Orange Valley estate is not particularly well documented. We know that the property was purchased from the Allen family in 1757 by Herbert Newton Jarrett II. Jarrett would marry Anne Allen, sister of the previous owner's wife, and their son, Herbert Newton Jarrett III, would inherit the property, but primarily lived as an absentee landowner in Great Britain. Jarrett II had constructed a great house shortly after his purchase of the property, and portions of that structure, seen here in an 18th century watercolor, portions of that structure still stand. Here they are today. The house was placed on a hill to surveil the slave houses, the yards, and the sugar mill complex. And in this image, also from, probably from the very early 19th century, we can see the great house to the left and the mill complex in the center. And over here, almost in shadow, is the village for enslaved workers, or one of the villages for enslaved workers. The estate is largely intact. The family burial ground is still there. The ruins of the house, which we were only starting to look at when we had to stop our work or take a hiatus because of the pandemic, are very impressive and worth further investigation. And you can see that the house was fortified. Here are some gun ports in one of the walls. There's also a small tower, small fortified tower known as the Spanish Folly, that's located about a mile south of the house and may have served to provide warning of impending attacks on the plantation, which was located relatively close to maroon settlements. And there are very extensive remains of the sugar mills, which still stand, as does a manager's house, a warehouse, a lime kiln, and several kitchens associated with the great house. When Jarrett III acquired the property, he undertook some pretty significant improvements, including constructing the hospital. And this was a very finely appointed building, and I see it as, in part, his architectural contribution to the then raging debate over the condition of enslaved people living on sugar plantations. And it would have served, among other things, to telegraph to abolitionists in Great Britain and to other planters in Jamaica his desire to be perceived as someone mindful of the health of enslaved people on his properties. During his tenure, the property became one of the largest sugar plantations in Trelawny Parish. This is a photograph, obviously, from the very late 19th century at a different plantation, but it sort of speaks to the lives of the people who worked here. Jean Besson notes that there were 614 enslaved individuals working at Orange Valley in 1817. By 1828, that number had risen to 641. The sugar crop was valued at 20,000 pounds sterling a year. Jarrett III would die at the age of 64 in 1829. His demise precipitated by a fall from a hammock, rather curious way to go. The mid-19th century history of the site is not particularly well documented. However, published records in the Handbook of Jamaica note the number of individuals employed on the estate and the amount of crops produced. It looks like there are about 225 to 290 acres of cane in cultivation. during the 19th century. Cane continued to be cultivated here until the 1950s. The Henderson family, current owners, acquired the property in 1956. Now, there are references to the existence of slave hospitals in Jamaica and elsewhere in the British Caribbean, as well as in the southeastern United States, from the early 1700s. They were often referred to as hot houses or sick houses, and many were quite simple buildings, and they were often criticized as being insufficient for their purpose. A number of these structures survive in ruined form in Jamaica, and you saw some images in Hayden's fantastic presentation about the largest of those at the Good Hope Plantation, a near neighbor of Orange Valley. This hospital would have served a population of over 2,000 slaves on estates owned by John Tharp. Other surviving examples are at Kellett's in Worthy Park. However, the Orange Valley Hospital is noteworthy in that it's particularly well preserved. The larger hospitals appear to have been influenced by the best advice available to planters and were designed to have separate wards for men and women, rooms for childbirth, and quarantine areas. It's also really important to note that plantation hospitals, while superficially constructed to provide a place of healing for enslaved people, also serve to maintain and indeed increase the enslaved workforce in a capitalist plantation system. And they could also be used and were used as places of confinement. This is a digital reconstruction created by my colleague, Dr. Adam Heinrich. The hospital at Orange Valley is a good example of a spacious, well-appointed hospital building, larger than most found on Jamaican estates. Two-story structure built of cut limestone. It's beautifully designed. It has paired hip roofs of the style common in the Caribbean to reduce hurricane damage. That roof may have been covered in slates, as we found a substantial number of slate fragments in our excavations. There were also copper roofing nails. They had very impressive windows, such as this one. This is probably an ocular window from up above on the second story. And these windows would have let in light. They may have also, if there was glass let into these windows, certainly increased the heat in the building. And they could have also served in part to confine people to the structure. Perhaps most intriguing, or the most intriguing feature of the structure, is a plaque mounted in the front of the loggia of the hospital. It's inscribed in Latin, and I'll give you a translation. It says, "This hospital was built under the auspices of H.N. Jarrett, Esquire, architect E. Earl, building foreman R. Harris, A.D. 1797, not unmindful of the unfortunate." So we've performed, and we being Monmouth University, we've performed 3 seasons of excavation at this site. And this led to Nikki Kelly's master's thesis and a soon-to-be published article in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology. And Nikki and I were assisted by Sean McHugh, whom you see here in a green t-shirt, and Timothy Dinsmore. We've had over 35 students participate in this work, and we looked at really the sort of half-acre yard located to the south or rear of the hospital. Excavations have consisted of 24 shovel tests and 4 1-meter square excavation units. So it's a pretty modest sort of project in that sense. And we've recovered just under 4,000 artifacts and identified 5 archaeological features. The artifact assemblage is very rich, given how little work we've done. There's a considerable amount of, oh, I'm sorry, I'm out of order here. Here's one of the features we've excavated. The subsoil is revealed up here. You have a mortared floor here with a brick pier. We're not sure if this is a cooking related feature or something else. In fact, I'd welcome your interpretations, and hopefully if we get to go back, we can expose more of this feature. The faunal assemblage is quite rich, includes bone from bird, fish, medium and large mammals, especially pig and cattle, as well as sheep and goat. There are also a large number of snail shells that may or may not be related to foodways. Bottle glass is also very common on the site. Most of the bottles are paste molded, dark green glass bottles, some of which are marked with Bristol marks, and they date from the early 19th century. There are also a handful of small aqua bottles that may be medicine bottles. Ceramics make up a large portion of the assemblage, and these include plain creamware, pearlware, whiteware vessels. Banded and annular wares are especially common, particularly those with sort of dendritic patterns or dendritic decoration. And you see some of those banded wares down here. And I know that colleagues working on other sites in Jamaica, the Bahamas, Barbados have also found these wares in substantial numbers. One thing we don't have that's a little bit curious is we really don't have Afro-Caribbean wares, right? So that's a little bit odd here. In fact, we only found one fragment that we could really say is a locally produced earthenware, perhaps from Yaba. Other artifacts include cast iron kettle shards, bone-handled cutlery, a pewter spoon seen here with a very excited student, and an iron colander fragment. Matthew Reeves has had similar spoons on archaeological sites in Jamaica. Personal items are especially interesting, and they speak to what's going on here. So we have a number of beads, black glass, white glass, pink glass, and blue glass beads are especially common here. And that's noteworthy because on sites associated with enslaved African Americans in North America, blue glass beads seem to be particularly common. There's also a locally made earthenware bead that I will show you in just a little bit. Clothing related items are also common, including 26 buttons, some of which you see here in this image. And that may be because the clothes, either we could have laundry occurring in this area, right? Or we could have clothes perhaps of people with contagious illnesses that were being incinerated. Tobacco pipes and stems are also common. Many are marked TD for Thomas Dormer, London pipe maker. But TD pipes, they're almost like Marlboro cigarettes. They become sort of ubiquitous by the early 19th century. Smoking, of course, we recognize is problematic from a health perspective, but may have actually been seen as healthful in this time period. So the artifact assemblage speaks pretty strongly to food and alcohol consumption, not particularly strongly to medical practices. And that may indicate that one of the things that was being done to improve the health of patients at the hospital was perhaps serving them better food. And I think more analysis of the faunal remains may provide us with some information there. No directly medical implements were recovered, though fragments of an ointment jar, tin glaze ointment jar, were noted. The artifacts, especially beads, buttons, and tobacco pipe fragments, highlight the creation and maintenance of individual identities among the enslaved population. And I think that's particularly important. The organization of the hospital yard, and this looks sort of like a heat graph, but the areas that are white or maroon have more artifacts than the areas that are green or sort of light blue. Organization of the hospital yard shows that there are rich middens both sort of abutting the building and also around this feature that I showed you before, that again may be some sort of hearth feature, perhaps a cooking area. This whole yard was probably hidden in part by fences, so the accumulation of trash against the back wall of the building may not have been immediately visible from the great house. Now, one of our best artifacts is, in fact, not something we excavated at all, but a ledger, a journal, held by the Hendersons, the owners of the property, and kept in the estate office. It's a detailed plantation ledger covering the years 1822 through 1830, and that aligns incredibly well with the time period of the archaeological deposits that we are unearthing. It's about 300 pages long, and we made a digital copy of the entire journal. It's encyclopedic in its coverage. It lists births and deaths on the estate, payments of all kinds, goods produced for export, goods imported from England, staff hiring and firing, slave child inoculations, interestingly enough, slave birthing payments, hospital staff, and drugs imported for the hospital. And here you see Ashley Parker and Joe Grabus recording it. This is one of the pages, not one of the best photos. This is from 1826. And this is a listing of some of the medical supplies. So each year there is a record of medications, pharmaceuticals purchased from a London pharmaceutical house. And these are fabulous. So 1822, there are 52 different entries, opium, antimonial powders, lancets, gum arabic, supercarbonate of soda, camphor, red precipitate. There are also medical supplies, pewter bedpans, lancets, syringes, chip pill boxes, midwifery scissors, mortars, and pestles. Now, we haven't found those artifacts, right? But they are represented in this ledger. So pretty amazing detail there. These medications were administered to the patients by a team of enslaved doctors and nurses. The only mention of a white doctor in the ledger is a Dr. Anderson, who apparently was being paid in rum, at least in part, and who lived for a while on the estate. However, there were 7 members of the plantation staff who were deeply involved in healthcare. This is one of those records of the number of births and the number of deaths. So one of the functions of the hospital, right, is to try to increase the number of births on the plantation. Here's a snippet that shows the medical staff. And these individuals are paid in order of importance. So there's a midwife who's Kate, the head midwife, very well paid. And then you can see other individuals listed there as well. We have a head doctor, not Mary Price, not paid as well as the midwife. We have a second doctor, and we have other individuals who are also assisting. So 2 girl orderlies, for instance. So pretty interesting insight into how the hospital would have been functioning. The ledger also reflects some tragedies. There was an epidemic of measles in 1822 that took the lives of 7 of 13 children who died that year. So this plantation ledger is both a document, but it's also an artifact. And it's an incredible resource for the detail it provides about conditions at Orange Valley, but it's equally disturbing for what it reveals about the hospital and hospital staff and how they were deployed, in a sense, to perpetuate the institute of slavery after the slave trade had ended. The archaeological investigation of the Orange Valley plantation is ongoing. To date, excavations have focused on the slave hospital. There's also been good work by DAX on the village for enslaved laborers. Even with very limited archaeological testing, our fieldwork is providing new information about the lives of the hundreds of enslaved people who lived and worked on the estate. The building itself is a massive public statement, right? Ostensibly a testament to the largesse of its financier, Herbert Newton Jarrett III. Today, it's a well-preserved ruin with a schoolboy Latin inscription directed as much to abolitionists as to Jarrett's fellow planters. Its meticulously ordered Georgian facade speaks to the rationality of the Enlightenment. While the hospital did serve to provide rest and healing, it was also a place of confinement and coercion. The artifacts were covering relate more directly to foodways and personal identity than to medical care per se. But they also speak to the maintenance, and here's one of our favorites. This is a locally made earthenware bead. They also speak to the maintenance of individual identities, even under the iron hand of slavery. The hospital yard was extensively employed for trash disposal, a practice that seems to have slowed after emancipation, when the building was likely abandoned or perhaps repurposed as a warehouse or for some other function. The material record is complemented by a rich documentary record in the form of a surviving plantation ledger. Nearly 2 centuries ago, Kate, the head midwife, and Mary Price, the head doctor, labored in the Orange Valley Slave Hospital, a European building in a Caribbean landscape, in a world predominantly inhabited by people of African descent. They may have used traditional medicines, good food, and rest as they worked to help those laboring in the darkness of slavery survive. As a result of the archaeological and historical research at Orange Valley, we can begin to tell their story as well as the story of Herbert Newton Jarrett and his fellow planters, and we can see the many contradictions embodied by the Hospital for the Unfortunate. So thanks so much for having me as part of your symposium here today. I'm really honored, and these are some of the many people who deserve our thanks for assistance with this project. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rich. And again, the whole question of all of this and how it folds into our database, our base of knowledge, and what we can go forward. I think that's one of the important aspects of what we're doing here today. So let me introduce our third and fourth, but third speaker. And so we have a collaboration here between Sean Devlin and Jillian Galle. And so I'm going to introduce them briefly first. Sean is he is, what is your correct title? He's curator of archaeological collections at George Washington's Mount Vernon. He's currently completing a PhD in anthropology at the University of Minnesota, and his research interests center on the origins, evolution, and legacies of the plantation system within Anglo-colonial societies. As such, his work has included research at numerous sites in Virginia, as well as the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica. And he has done quite a bit of work at Stewart Castle in Jamaica, which is another major estate in Trelawny, in the parish of Trelawny. And Dr. Jillian Galle has directed the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, which has been mentioned here at Monticello since its inception in 2000. She received her PhD from the University of Virginia in 2006. And I actually met Jillian in 2008 when work started at Papina and Mona, but I think that's a whole nother webinar. Jillian Galle specializes in early modern Atlantic world material culture and studies how women and men have used material culture to navigate slavery and freedom throughout the Caribbean and the southeastern United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. As director of DAX, she coordinates archaeological research on comparative slavery across the US and Caribbean and ensures the work is made freely accessible to scholars and the public through the DAX website. She has active fieldwork collaborations in Jamaica and has led fieldwork in Nevis, St. Kitts, Virginia, and Tennessee. She's also the editor of Engendering African American Archaeology, 2004, and has published articles in American Antiquity, the Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory, and numerous edited volumes. She's currently editing a volume for the University of Alabama Press titled Beyond the Mansion, 30 Years of Archaeological Research on Slavery at the Hermitage. Sean and Jillian are going to be presented on ongoing archaeological research at the Stewart Castle estate in Trelawny, Jamaica. I'm not quite sure how you've organized this, guys, but I'm handing it over to you.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and I'll start off and then hand it to Sean. and Sean will hand it back to me if we have time. But thank you very much for the invitation, and we both look forward to sharing our work at Stuart Castle. So let me does everybody see my screen? All right, thumbs up. Take that away. Okay, excellent. So 18th century Jamaica was powered by the labor of well over 1 million enslaved Africans who toiled in the production of sugar, coffee, indigo, and livestock. The violence and brutality of Jamaican slavery was inescapable. It tangibly shaped daily social, economic, and political interactions and left indelible marks on the physical, material, and psychological landscape. Few places on the island are better examples of this than Stuart Castle. Located a little over 6 miles east of Falmouth, Jamaica, in Trelawny Parish, Stuart Castle is nearly forgotten. The once large sugar estate lies in ruins deep in the bush. Although threatened by development, most major components of the original 1,200-acre property remain visible to those willing to look for them. Patented in 1754 by James Stewart I, Stuart Castle was initially a small landholding of 167 acres that did not produce sugar on a meaningful scale until after 1776. By 1779, the estate grown to 1,230 acres, with 500 acres planted in sugarcane. During that same period, a remarkably detailed plat of the property that included the field acreage and type, location of the main house, overseer and sugar works, and the wharf was produced by the Jamaican surveying team of Monroe, Stevenson, and Innes. The plat also labels at least 43 structures located on approximately 45 acres as, quote, Negro houses, end quote. This village likely housed most of the 330 enslaved people living at Stuart Castle in the late 18th through early 19th centuries. And I'm just toggling back to Zach's great drone shot of Stuart Castle in 2019 and laying for you on top of it, you know, the locations of these sites that we see on the 1799 plat. So you, again, see the main house here in the center, the village down this road, which is actually represented on the 1799 plat, provision grounds, the wharf, and the overseer and works. The overseer's house is no longer standing. It was standing in the late 2000s and was documented by Edward Chappell. The village is still relatively intact, as are the provision grounds. The wharf has been significantly, from what I've been told, significantly impacted by current development along the shoreline there. So it was the 1799 plat and the relatively intact archaeological resources that drew me and DAC's archaeologists to the site in 2007. I had been working on Jamaica since 2005 in my capacity as project director for the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, which you've heard a bit about today already. It's known as DACS, and I just want to give you sort of a quick introduction to what DACS is for those who aren't familiar. We're a research institute based at Monticello in Virginia that's dedicated to the comparative archaeological study of enslaved people and slave societies in the early modern Atlantic world. We have a number of goals. The first one is to create standardized, comparable archaeological data from sites of enslavement across North America and the Caribbean. And we make those data accessible, freely accessible to scholars via our website. Freely accessible to not only scholars, but to the public. Anyone can access the data that we create and we make available. A second goal of ours is to create and apply standardized methods to material culture, identification, digitization for anyone working on historic period sites. These are standards that could be used by any historical archaeologist. And we have collaborators who are working on early Spanish mission sites that use DACS, who are working on contact period Native American to European contact sites. But the bulk of the archaeologists who collaborate with DACS work on sites of enslavement in the early modern world. Another goal is to train archaeologists in standardized material culture identification and in field methods. So Hayden's work is a great example of somebody who came through our program and who implemented the methods that we've been using for the last 15 years. And then to also actively support archaeologists of color through internships, fellowships, and positions with the archive. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So DAX had come to Jamaica in 2005 to work with the University of West Indies and the Jamaican National Heritage Trust. Oh, I should say, and we make all these data accessible on our website, which is here's just a quick screenshot, dax.org. You can go there now if you want. And actually in 2020, this is a shot of, we've got 85 data from over 85 sites available through DAX with 4 million records and growing. And this is a view of exactly each one of these orange bullseyes is in a state or a site, in a state with multiple sites or a single site that are in DAX, that is in DAX. So anyways, DAX came to Jamaica in 2005 to work in collaboration with the University of West Indies and the Jamaican National Heritage Trust on a project to make all of the archaeological data from Montpelier and Seville estates freely accessible to the public through the DAX website. During our 5 months on the island, my colleagues and I worked both at UWI and at the JNHT Archaeology labs. I taught the archaeological methods class at UWI in 2006 and had Clive Gray as one of my students that year. And I was also, while there, very lucky to have opportunities to explore the island with Barry Higman, Thera Edwards, Lewis Nelson, Fraser Nyman, Philip Allsworth-Jones, and Valerie Facey, as well as on my own with lots of tips from friends at JNHT and UWI. And you know, in the course of explorations, Fraser Nyman and I in particular became interested in applying new methodological approaches to understanding enslavement on sugar estates, approaches that were different from those currently used by archaeologists working in the Caribbean. Until we began fieldwork in the Caribbean in 2007, the principal approach to understanding sites of slavery archaeologically was through quadrat excavation focused methods, where sort of the focus was on individual households, which is an excellent approach, but one that might not give the full scope of what's happening at these densely populated villages like Hayden showed us. So this is just an example of a site map, a central plantation site map of Barry Higman's work at Montpelier Estate. And he focused on in depth on 4 main households across the estate. All of the data from these households are available in DAX, as well as all these maps. But you know, as we've seen in Hayden's presentation and in Rich's presentation, the majority of these states had villages which housed hundreds of enslaved Africans and Afro-Jamaicans. And these are just a handful of plats from around the Caribbean that represent some of these villages, what these villages look like on the landscape. So while the quadrat method provides excellent coverage and understanding of specific buildings and households on an estate, it does not provide a holistic overview of the complexity of plantation spaces, particularly the large and densely populated villages. And as I said, archives are full of these estate plats that detail what these villages looked like. And when I say look, you know, as Hayden mentioned, these are sort of schematics. These are not, you can't apply them directly to the ground, but they at least help us locate where these large settlements were. So instead of focusing initially on individual households, we wanted to use shovel test pit methods. That's digging 50 centimeter in diameter shovel test pits like these across a site every 6 meters to understand how villages changed over time and space. And more importantly, we wanted to see how the dispersed material record of the enslaved people living in these villages might reveal strategies they used to survive enslavement and the brutal labor demands of sugar production. And these are just a couple examples of shovel test pits at Stewart Castle, and this is Dr. Iva Connelly digging an especially deep one in the Stewart Castle courtyard in 2007. So I'm too short to reach down that far, but Ivor can do it. So in 2007, we geo-rectified the 1799 Monroe-Stevenson and Innis Plat with a modern topographic map of the area to pinpoint the exact location of the now densely overgrown village. Deep in the bush, just to the southeast of the main road, or the main house, we found cobble piles representing remnants of Spanish walled houses, graves, cut limestone foundations, and extensive landscape terracing that marked the location of the village represented on the plat. In the same area, a thick scatter of late 18th century domestic artifacts extends well over 33,000 square meters. In one short field season in 2007, a field crew comprised of Dax and Jamaican archaeologists, along with students and interns from the University of West Indies, Mona, and the University of Virginia, excavated over 200 shovel test pits and 3 1-by-1 meter excavation units. Here's just a quick view of, this is here the main house with each of these blue dots represents a shovel test pit. Here is a small section of the village that we were able to cover in 2007. Each one of these little dots is a test unit, and here's just a closer up of the main house with shovel test pits inside of the courtyard. Sean's going to talk about his work, which expands well outside of the main house. And here's just a quick view of the village, shovel test pits every 6 meters. And these are the 3 units that we put in around houses, around buildings that we had identified, or areas we had identified as buildings. So in the village alone, over 12,000 artifacts were recovered from over 170 shovel test pits. And this is just a quick spatial distribution map. I'll talk a little bit later at the end of this talk about, in more detail, about items that are coming out of the village and what that's telling us about household market participation and fishing and foraging strategies. But this just gives you a sense of how the distribution is giving us a look at sort of hotspots, potentially cleaned up yard spaces. Also, when we put time into this factor, we see that potentially there's an earlier component of the village to the north and a later component to the south. These are all projects we want to investigate more post-pandemic. So we could not have done this work in 2007, or any of the work actually we've done in Jamaica over the past 13 years, without the help of colleagues and collaborators at the University of West Indies and at the Jamaican National Heritage Trust. Soon after our work in 2007, actually we got snagged by UE to come back to campus and teach their field school between 2008 and 2011. And that's, as Suzanne said, that's when I met Suzanne, and we started working very closely on Papine and Mona, which is, I believe, another presentation slated for February, I think, Zach. So stay tuned on that. But these collaborations have resulted in work not only on Jamaica, but on Nevis and St. Kitts, with over 121,000 artifacts recovered and accessible via the DAX website. These projects, oops, and there's a shot of just a very small number of the 121,000 artifacts recovered from these sites. But a major focus of this work, aside from the archaeological research, has been on the training component of all of the work that we've done in Jamaica, Nevis, and St. Kitts. To date, these projects have trained over 50 field school students from the University of West Indies, provided paid internships for over 20 students, 4 international research fellowships, 5 National Endowment for the Humanities funded material culture fellowships, and 1 year-long postdoctoral fellowship, which Kadeen Harris just finished up prior to her arrival at Kenyon College for her assistant professorship. Also, this is just a quick shot of 4 PhDs who have earned their 4 former students who are now PhD'd who came through our program. So Dr. Iva Connelly, Dr. Suzanne Francis Brown, Dr. Kadeen Harris, and Dr. Sonay Jean. Also 3 other students who are currently pursuing their PhDs who all came through a UE DAX field school and internship program. So I'm gonna turn it over to Sean right now. Sorry, I'm looking at Zach, but I need to see Sean on my screen. And you'll hear from me a little bit at the end about our plans for the future at Stewart Castle.
Hi all. Thanks, Jillian, for handling the first part of the talk. As you heard earlier, my name is Sean Devlin. I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and when I was presented the opportunity to work with Jillian and the DAX group in Jamaica at Stewart Castle in partnership with the Jamaican National Heritage Trust and the collaborators that they've developed on the island, it was sort of a dream come true for a lot of reasons. One, to be engaged with such a active and sort of rewarding partnerships, but also turning a little bit towards sort of what my own involvement at Stewart Castle has been since 2016. I kind of wanted to, well, my focus ended up being on the Great House complex itself, right? As Jillian has described in 2007, and subsequently, Dax had worked pretty extensively at the village site, and they had done a little bit of work at the Great House to provide a comparative sample of material to evaluate those two sites against each other, right? Just to provide some comparative data. I was particularly interested in sort of expanding that. I thought this was a great opportunity to actually look at an entire plantation community through working together. So in 2016, as part of my field work for my project, I went down for a field season and worked with Iva Connelly, who we've heard his name many times today. Obviously, an incredibly important person in Jamaican archaeology. But he helped me. He literally led me by the hand through a lot of the processes of doing the field work, doing some of the other research work, helping establish me down there. So what I'd like to do maybe with this section is, I'll not lie, I know we are running short on time. So I will do a very brief run through. I also should say, as I said, I'm a dissertating student at the moment, so I did not do an extensive presentation because I was worried I would talk for 3 hours if I started getting into the details, or I would forget everything if I decided to talk just for 3 minutes. So please bear with me, and hopefully, though, some of the ideas, what I'd like to do is raise some of the ideas that maybe would be interesting to talk about at the end, really sort of move towards that notion of discussion. So I was particularly drawn to Stewart Castle itself, not just because of the collaborative opportunities, but because, as Jillian mentioned, it has an incredibly long history as a plantation in Trelawny, right? It was established in 1754 by James Stewart I, and operated as a plantation. I'll get a little bit more into the production in just a minute, hopefully, but actually was inherited by his son, James Stewart II, upon the father's death in 1784. And James Stewart II actually was a fairly prominent planter in Trelawny and in the colony of Jamaica overall. He ended up serving in the local militia, serving as a local magistrate. He served in the Second Maroon War with the British forces after the initial Maroon victories. And then additionally, he went on to be named Custis for Trelawny from the early 19th century through basically through 1828 and at his death. He also served in the assembly for over 3 decades. And I actually, that's one of the areas that I probably won't talk about that much today, but it's been really interesting to sort of look at legislative and sort of administrative roles and evidence bases that might be drawn upon. But what I really, I think, wanted to explore today was, or why I'm focusing on these planters to some degree, is because I think this period from roughly the middle of the 18th century through emancipation, or certainly the amelioration period and the years leading up to emancipation in Jamaica, really highlight the moment in which the colonial slave societies came under increasing pressures or challenges to planters' authorities, right? So what my larger project I hope could potentially do is explore the material and representational practices that planters like Stewart, resident planters like Stewart, may have deployed against this changing backdrop of challenges that are undercutting their power within Jamaican society. Now, part of why I want to do that, right, is I think that it is important to turn the focus back on the practices that those folks are using to maintain inequality and their social position as it's being challenged, right? It can help us perhaps identify processes by which, to be completely blunt about it, right, sort of white supremacy are perpetuated in social circumstances, particularly in these plantation societies that are sort of the antecedents to our own modern societies right now. So all of that is sort of the larger point that I would like to explore in my practice, in my project. Today, though, I think I will try and focus more specifically and quickly on one particular aspect, a physical aspect, and that is one of the things that drew me to Stewart Castle, as has been referenced, is the fact that it is a fortified great house. And I was interested, and there's been a lot of great work done on this notion about sort of fortification and notions about sort of imposition of control over landscapes and sort of representations that might make. What I wanted to try and do, though, was begin to explore how did this landscape develop over time. So to do that, and oh, I'm sorry, Jillian, I'm clicking my mouse button. Would you mind forwarding the slide? So to do that, today I'd like to talk about a couple of the archaeological techniques we deployed at the Great House in 2016. Like I said, with a great partnership of folks who were kind enough to come and work with me that summer. Hayden talked about STP surveys, Jillian talked about STP surveys. Everybody sort of talked about this at this point, so I won't belabor it. But here you can see that 1799 plat of the Great House location, which is comprised of several the house itself and several outbuildings. And there you can get a sense for the fact that we deployed the same methodology on the planter's domestic location, right? And there we were sort of attempting to create comparable data sets, obviously, but also then to sort of really use the techniques that have been developed as my fellow presenters here have talked about, and turn that analytical eye back on the planter's house as well. So Jillian, can you go ahead and do the next slide as well? So these, again, are just sort of some basic heat maps. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about just sort of what were the ideas that were starting to develop, or am I starting to develop, because I'm very much actively still working on the analysis. I'm much chagrined to say I haven't graduated yet. But here you can see from those STP surveys, we did some distribution maps, and we're able to identify more than just the standing architecture that was there. Sort of on the left-hand side, the all ceramic map, you can see that there is a clear differentiation of space. Just sort of in the upper section, you can see the red concentration that actually ended up being a midden feature I'll talk about in just a second. And so where you can see the concentrations of material, you can also see absences, right? So on the interior of this courtyard space, you can also see that there's an absence of ceramic, suggesting it's probably clean locations. And again, that's sort of a little bit lighter, but sort of use tobacco pipes as another comparison, another material as a comparison, thinking again that sort of speaks directly to laboring populations that's been used at some other sites as well. Jillian, can you go ahead? So I did speak about that midden, and I'm not going to address very much about it today. I had given a presentation at ASJ, the annual conference several years ago. I'd be more than happy to talk some more about this material later, but this was a great opportunity to actually find intact, what I believe is intact material culture from the household itself, and really lets us talk about issues of consumption and surprisingly also production, though, right? So it was particularly cool materials coming out of this deposits on the right, on my left-hand side. I guess everybody's left-hand side. We're all looking at the screens these days. You can see some objects that explicitly speak to production of the landscape, right? We have the hoe, we have an axe, speaking explicitly to the forced labor that served as sort of the capital producer for this household. And on the right-hand side, we can see some of the objects that speak directly to where that capital is being used for household consumption. So things like porcelain, a escutcheon from probably a furniture piece or a chest. Similarly, a lead bale seal marked London, again, emphasizing those transatlantic connections, right? Also, though, what's kind of interesting is as the objects down below the sort of map there are not actually from the midden, and I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself, maybe a little bit, but those are actually from some of the SDPs, and there you can see we have several what have been referred to as gaming pieces, these sort of rounded ceramic sherds. We have numerous ones from the SDPs throughout the domestic location. We even have what looks to be one of the local red Jamaican pipes, and it actually has a maker's mark on the heel, and unfortunately it's a little bit small to see, but it's quite interesting because I would, if other folks have found more of those, I would love to talk more extensively or learn more about them. I've seen a lot of the material from Port Royal, but I know that's much earlier than our site. But again, this notion, though, I wanted to kind of highlight that despite the fact that the midden context speaks quite clearly to the planter's household consumption, there are these bits of evidence throughout about the other peoples populating this landscape, right? And Jillian, can you do the next slide? Yeah, perfect. As I sort of turned again to thinking about how can we explore how this landscape may have changed over the course of that full nearly 80 years that it was occupied, and as the conditions that challenged planters' authority changed over that time. One of the things I started turning towards was thinking about, well, can we see change over time in the landscape? And obviously ceramics, archaeologists love ceramics for temporal reasons. This is just a very simplistic display of sort of mapping out distributions of the different ware types that sort of gained and lost popularity over the course of the late 18th century, early 19th century. I'm not going to suggest that it's horribly informative or that it's terribly deep in its analysis, but I do think that sort of we can see that there is some general changes in pattern from our early ceramics, which tend to include white salt glaze, stonewares, and delftwares, and things that tend to be at the earlier phases of the Stuart occupation, certainly before the 1760s. These items could have been available and may have been used at the first household. Creamwares and pearlwares, we can see a shift sort of towards what was the midden location. And then whitewares, which come in obviously much later, actually, we can see a great diminishment of the, quite literally the amount of material that's present at the site. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them in particular is the fact that ultimately, again, I'll stop too many details, but the James Stewart II was economically unsuccessful. So it's quite possible that the household itself after 1800 was not expending a lot of money on consumption in the household. But nevertheless, this notion about sort of looking at the landscape drove me to start thinking about, and seeing the ways that this shifted in the landscape made me start thinking about, well, can we begin to get a chronology of the building itself? Can we look at things that might sort of speak to the ways that the architecture as well as the archaeology is responding to time at Stuart Castle? So Jillian, if you wouldn't mind one more. Actually, so I will. This is true. I'm getting exactly at that. But even before that, we did another test unit excavation. Here you can see this is sort of in the map. This is the green box that's right at the corner of the sort of northern blue building that's outlined in red. And this is actually a staircase coming out of the main house, which you can see in the photograph, and it actually runs into the, I believe that's a kitchen, a dependency building to the north of the main house. And what we actually sort of found when we did the when we did the stratigraphic analysis is I think what we're actually seeing in that site is a topsoil layer, that's sort of a modern layer, followed by destruction, and then actually the staircase is sealed by that destruction, and possibly a prepared floor on the interior of the kitchen or a space on the exterior of the kitchen that's definitely mortared with lime. Again, Rich's imagery was good to see. I'd love to talk more about sort of what these features might represent. But in doing a very simplistic terminus post quem analysis, basically it's not many items. There was a single piece of pearlware that was found in the context. We excavated a small portion of the mortared feature, and we recovered some pearlware from there, which of course would have to date that feature after 1779. So that made me think, right, sort of the relationship between the stairs, the kitchen, and this ceramic date made me begin to think about sort of developing a chronology of the structure and how it may have changed over time. And Jillian, can you slide one more? So that entered a foray into architectural history, which hopefully I will not be beaten about the head by anybody with more specialized knowledge than myself. But I think I'm on pretty safe ground because it was looking at a relatively straightforward chronological sequence, and that was looking at quite literally the seaming in the stonework that's very visible in the standing ruins at Stuart Castle itself. And here I've just sort of laid out a map that sort of highlights a couple of images. There you can see the seams that are numbered and the imagery. I'm not sure if that's coming through terribly well on the presentation here. But basically we can see that there are 4 exterior seams and an interior seam that there's clearly a wall has been bonded to an earlier one. So using that analysis, Jillian, could you do the next slide? I developed a chronology for the site. This is Stuart Castle 1, just using that convention of 1, 2, 3, and what it seems to be is basically a centralized core of the house. And again, this is not terribly different than some of the previous work that was done at Stuart Castle by my predecessors, by Jillian and Ned Chappell and Lewis Nelson, and actually a Jamaican amateur. No, he's not Jamaican, is he, Jillian? No, Stephen Panning is an amateur architectural historian who was in Jamaica for a while and visited the site and did an analysis. He actually may have come closest, I think, to some of the actual chronology of the site. Regardless, let me return here that the centralized core is this single room building outlined in purple, and that would have been the original walls. I paired that up against this 1763 map by, I believe it's Thomas Craskill of the County of Cornwall. Obviously, this is a small inset of a much larger map. And this is the first map of Jamaica in which Stuart is labeled on one of these documents. Interestingly, again, it's a little bit small, but getting at that production history, the symbol, the little square used on this 1763 map for Stuart is for pimento indigo pen planter's seat rather than the sugar plantations. So this seems to align very well with the sort of the documentary record for Stuart Castle under James Stuart I, who upon his death, the inventories suggested Stuart Castle was producing only a single hogshead of sugar. That's going to stand in stark contrast to the next phase at Stuart Castle. Jillian, would you mind scrolling one more time? And I'll show that little map, if we return to that, is actually an inset of the Robertson map from 1804. But it actually does represent Stuart Castle as a sugar plantation at that point. And I think that really reflects the investment of James Stuart II in production of sugar at Stuart Castle, purchasing other lands in the surrounding area. I think, while I cannot tie Stuart, I find, given that we have the 1779 date, For the kitchen building, I'm not terribly certain if we can give that when Stuart Castle 2 is built, but I do think it seems most likely that it's a massive expansion of the household, including rooms on 3 sides of the original core. 2 towers, it looks like, most likely go up during this period, and possibly some of these outbuildings have gone up either before or contemporaneous with this expansion of the household. What I think is particularly interesting is that, again, that expenditure of money and the turn towards production of sugar at the estate might be linked. I might be attempting to make arguments such as that in the future. One thing that I think is particularly interesting is the fact that in the lower image here, you can see a limestone walkway that actually extends into the current courtyard. And that is actually placed on the western exterior doorway of the Stuart Castle Phase 2, creating this sort of symmetrical aspect of the household. And also, what I think is particularly interesting, and we'll see in just a second, Jillian, again, maybe could you scroll one more time, is the way that landscape is radically altered by the final phase at Stuart Castle, which is the one that we see today, which is the addition of the courtyard wall and a subsequent structure on the interior of the courtyard. And actually, what's most interesting to me is the fact that actually seems to truncate that Stuart Castle 2 landscape, right? Here we can see that same walkway leading directly into the corner of this new outbuilding that's been inset into the courtyard. Also, another addition to to Stuart Castle 3 is a room which the staircase came out of that I showed the test unit of earlier, that includes a cistern. And as well, this courtyard wall, as some folks may know, some may not, is complete with the rifle loops and broken glass mortared into the top of the wall. So again, this sort of like very strong sense of a fortified location. And let's go one more slide, Jillian. I'll try and wrap this up. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going a little bit long, I think. But so we've created this sort of chronology of the household itself, and I wanted to start thinking through, what does this mean, right? Returning back to this notion about how are the practices being deployed here over time possibly different? And I don't think I have an answer by any means. Again, I hope this is an area for discussion maybe later as we continue on. But obviously, there are the issues of sort of ways of traditionally been thinking about fortifications as literally protective, right? So there is the Second Maroon War. There is also obviously the continual maroonage of enslaved individuals who are living in the Trelawny backcountry, and there are continual conflicts and efforts by the planters to eradicate those settlements, and obviously the sort of back and forth conflicts that occur from that. So there may be an actual literal protective element to this landscape. Following on some of the work that folks like Jim Dell have done in the south of the country, there may also be this notion of control. And Hayden spoke quite eloquently about sort of infrastructure of control at Good Hope. This simple illustration on the lower corner does sort of indicate that this is in the final plan of Stuart Castle, a real element of control of interior and exterior space, both into the household itself and into the courtyard, right? There are a few areas of entry and very controlled pathways in and out of these spaces. But at the same time, I think it's quite interesting where a lot of these notions, when we talk about control, are about planters imposing that onto the landscape through their own intentions, right, and sort of expressing their power. There is this incident that happens in 1816 that actually comes up. It's a advertisement in Cornwall Courier, and I have to say Jillian is the first one to alert me to it. But it actually, on July 25th in 1816, Stewart Castle was the subject of a robbery. While the family slept, individuals came inside and took a whole list of material culture. That's really fascinating in and of itself. Subsequently, actually following that story through the newspapers, at least the Stewart Castle enslaved person was accused of that robbery, actually resulted in that person's death. But again, it does show, right, highlight at least the notion about complicating our notion of what does control mean if even within this highly fortified landscape, a household that can be robbed while a family's sleeping. Maybe it's just the next slide, Jillian. Ooh. And finally, I wanted to, again, build on this notion of complexity and also begin to draw in some of the interdisciplinary sources that are available because of Stewart Castle being Stewart Castle. Actually, one of the ideas was thinking about architecture maybe less as a more representational space, particularly this fortified architecture. So James Stewart II actually in 1792 appears to have authored a text. It's an apologist text for slavery. It's it's one of these terrible books that attempts to strengthen the position of the planter class with the British public opinion in the lead up to abolition of the slave trade and other measures that are taken. But in this text, one of the most interesting parts is that Stewart really seems to be staking out a position. And I do want to read this, and I apologize for going on a little bit long here. But I think it's an important one because I think he's attempting to, in this moment in which the Creole Jamaican white planters are coming under increasing otherization from the British metropolitan interests, as can be seen in some of these political cartoons, as illustrated on the other side. Stewart seems to be sticking out a place that's sort of a generational argument suggesting that Creole white Jamaicans are no different than metropolitan British citizens. So he says in this text, many of the first proprietors of the colonies were needy adventurers from the mother country who were destitute of education, and that from the lowliest occupations they gradually acquired by the slow, although certain means of economy, a property in slaves, from whose labors they impatiently expected to extend their fortunes. It is not difficult to account for the harsh treatment of the Negroes. When those persons amassed fortunes, formed matrimonial alliances, and became fathers, they were ambitious of bestowing on their children in education. This rising generation, which again, being cognizant of who's saying this, right, is himself. He's talking about his father in that previous statement, his father's generation at least. He's speaking about his own generation here. This rising generation was separated from their parents, conveyed to Britain, and allowed to receive such instruction as their capacities admitted, right? In essence, arguing that they were educated and trained and acculturated in Britain. Perhaps, Jillian, you could do one more slide. And that's sort of where the material evidence drops away for me. The Stewart Castle main house archaeology does not really seem to extend much past that early 19th century, but we can draw on Stewart's legislative history and begin to dig in the documents and not only find that his role in sort of the coming amelioration battles in the assembly, but also begin to tie that back to the enslaved population that we can draw from documentary records. So obviously the registries. We're also, thanks to Suzanne's work in the archives actually too, we were recently able to recover a list of enslaved persons that was part of a mortgage that Stewart had created in well, he actually mortgaged the enslaved individuals in 1797, I believe. So what we can begin to create a better understanding about how that community existed in the second decades of the 19th century. And I think that specifically be attempting to recover some of the documentary records about that enslaved community may also speak directly to some of Jillian's subsequent work in the village and some of the materials that she's been finding.
Put up your thank you. Is that?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. Hey, once again, I always forget the thank you slide. So
that's all right. So
thank you to everyone.
Thank you. And I was going to talk briefly about some of the things that we actually are pursuing right now in the village, but we're at 1 o'clock. So what I'm going to do instead is just let you know that the focus on the village, our most current work is looking at fishing and foraging strategies among enslaved households of this village. There's an incredible faunal record that's animal bone and fish bone and shellfish. And there was a direct connection between the village and the shoreline, which you can see here on the plat. I'm just going to quickly go through. Looking at the distribution of the different taxon, shellfish dominates the assemblage in the village, fish less so than mammals, suggesting that enslaved households were really heavily relying on fish and shellfish to provide protein, critical protein in their diets. And I'm linking the faunal data to, I'm just going to bomb through this, to costly and imported refined wares, ceramic wares, as well as decorative ceramics and luxury goods to sort of look at ways enslaved men, women, and children acquired fish and shellfish and then translated that into market activities that would have allowed them to participate in market economies in the Monmouth area. I gave a talk on this about 6 weeks ago. It's on the DAX website. You can go watch me talk about it for 45 minutes if you'd like. So our post-pandemic goals, this summer we were supposed to be back in Jamaica, collaborating with UE and the Trust on environmental sampling, and then seeking grant funding to return for multiple field seasons. And that is our long-term goal. So we expect to be back on island late 2021, I hope. So thank you very much.
Hey, Suzanne, unmute, please. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Zach. Suzanne. I thought I had.
No problem.
Thank you. So really, I want to first thank the presenters for bringing to the attention of persons who may not have had all of these elements all together, the incredible richness of the material that they have uncovered in the Parish of Trelawny, in this particular area of the Parish of Trelawny, within the early years of the 21st century. Jillian's work coming from 2007, Rich from 2016, I think Hayden 2013 coming up, and much of that material, as Jillian mentioned, available through the DAX website, and of course the opportunities that exist for making that material available. There were some questions relating to the where that material presently is. And I know that some of that was being answered in the chat, and I'm sure that people have seen it, but much of the material is in the island. And the whole question of how it is represented and how it is made available to people is, of course, of ongoing relevance. But certainly one of the good things is that the material that is available on dax.com, right, Jillian, or .org, is freely available and is incredibly detailed down to individual artifacts. So there's a lot that can be done in terms of interpretation there. I just wanted to very, very briefly, for the benefit of those who may have questions, and I know we're over time, but I think we're hoping that we can hold this for another few minutes. just to remind you of our presenters. So Hayden Bassett looking at Good Hope Estate, the center of the Tharp Empire, looking at both the level of the individual home within the village, but also at a broader infrastructure in terms of the community as a social process, but also looking at the wider landscape and the politics of control, if you like, using that data. And it was interesting looking at that whole question of control and of those estates that are fortified, which of course comes back to Stuart Castle. Also, Rich looking at the whole question of the Orange Valley estate, and particularly the hospital, looking at issues of health and places of confinement, those two things coming together, especially in the area when amelioration is being discussed as one way of dealing with, at the same time, continuing enslavement. Also looking at the paucity of Afro-Caribbean wares, which itself is an interesting thing in that area of that estate, since on several of the other estates, there is more of that assemblage. Also talking about the alignment of ledger, historical, as well as archaeological landscape and architectural evidence in that situation. And Jillian and Sean looking at the Stuart Castle estate. One of the interesting things, of course, is that whereas the Orange Valley and certainly the Good Hope estate, far more consistent riches, Stuart Castle a little bit more inconsistent in relation to the amount of economic capacity there, and that, of course, Jillian and I have been looking at diversification, and of course that is also something that comes up when sugar is not producing enough wealth. But they're looking at Stuart Castle, at the wider community interactions, at the issue of survey methods and the different survey methods and their strengths. Also at the challenges to colonial slave societies and the impact of those challenges on planters like James Stewart and the extent to which the changes can be seen in the landscapes over time. So just some of the things that emerge out of these three very rich presentations that we've had. I just wanted to mention a couple of the other things that very much came to mind. The whole question of Jamaican archaeologists is one that has come up in the context of this. And I think one of the strong things that has come out is that there have been efforts and possibilities for the training of young Jamaican archaeologists. However, the question of job capabilities in Jamaica is quite another question, and how persons can fund research for themselves out of our present situation. And I think that's an ongoing story, and a number of the persons who have come out of these programs have found their way overseas, and hopefully will perhaps use those resources to come back and do more research as well. Iva Connelly's name has come up a number of times. He was on a previous panel, because the fact of the matter is that he's a pre-Columbian man, even though he has been so important in so many different aspects of Jamaican archaeology, and as Sean said, holding people's hands through many of the various aspects. And it's great to see all the other young archaeologists whose names have come up so many times in the thank yous and acknowledgements and so on of the presentations. I'm interested in the overlaps between the estates, in the ability of people to better understand what's been going on and perhaps where the gaps are that need to be filled. One of the things I was interested in when Hayden talked about the road networks is it struck me that when I've looked at the enslaved runaway ads, the ads for runaway individuals, and the whole question of how the networks speak to some of the capacity of people to move about in that context. Fortification, of course, is important, economic difference, the whole period of amelioration and what that has meant. And of course, going forward, the continued discussion, the continued conversation between archaeology and history to better understand our heritage and our history. In terms of heritage tourism, in terms of the way in which things are represented, the ways in which all of this can contribute going forward. So those are just a few of the things that I've taken from it. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'm going to pass it over to Zach and see what we can do there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Suzanne. We do have time for questions. All I know we're 10 minutes past the hour, but this has just been, full of information. We do have sets of questions that we've been noting. So I think I'll just begin with the earliest ones and then move forward. We had a good question from Rosie. I think it's sad that despite all your, Hayden, and Kevon and the team's work on recreating the slave dwelling, that it's not mentioned or featured on the Good Hope or Chukka website. For those that don't know, Chukka is a major Jamaican tourism company. John Aaron's recent piece, John Aaron's was the previous UE archivist, titled The Colonial Past and Heritage Tourism, highlights the Jamaican dilemma. And yet such recreations are made much of on plantations in the US and are important and interesting places to visit. So maybe not really a question from Rosie, at least at that point. We've got other ones from Rosie, but a concern. I don't know if any of our panelists or perhaps an audience member or two have some comments about that, seemingly about the lack of engagement of property owners or tourism companies with presenting these sites as potentially as attractions for locals and international tourists. Any thoughts there, all?
I'll just quickly respond to that. Is that it's at Good Hope, and I think this is an example for a lot of the heritage tourism industry in Jamaica. But at Good Hope, you have two entities. You have Good Hope itself, private landowner, all the buildings, the history is generated on that side. But then you have the company of Chukka, who's the one bringing in people from the cruise lines and from, on different tours and that type of thing. And Chukka, the side, unfortunately, is more focused on the outdoor recreational side of Good Hope, whereas the landowners and, the archaeology side, that stuff is unfortunately at this moment not as a part of the Chukka tours, but is very much a part of the landscape. So we consider it at least a first step in sort of rebuilding the heritage landscape at a place like Good Hope in making slavery more visible.
Hayden, thank you. I'm cutting in and out. Thanks, Rosie, for your follow-up there. I'm not sure if anybody else, I don't want to cut anyone from potentially responding to that, but thank you, Hayden, there. I'm not seeing any hands, so I'm just going to move to the next. Is there a hand?
Let me jump in just for a second, Zach. I would say at Orange Valley, which is not really on sort of the tourist trail currently, Jackie and Alec Henderson, the property owners, they've invested heavily in trying to maintain and preserve the sites associated with the estate's history. And I don't know if it will ever become sort of a tourist destination or not. Their primary source of income is as an equestrian facility right now. But I've been impressed by their interest in trying to maintain what are really enormous and costly historic structures to take care of. So I think that's heartening on some level.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rich. And obviously, I mean, just in terms of Caribbean heritage in general, this legacy of colonialism is really established, I think, in many heritage managers or companies' minds. Good sides of heritage: sun, sea, sand, sex, and a variety of other things, carnival, reggae, food. But the plantations, the colonial forts that have remained from that area, most certainly difficult, I think, in how those are managed and how those are presented. Rosie raised another issue, and I'm noting all of them, but I think this is particularly pertinent with regard to the paucity of Black archaeologists in Jamaica. What are the stats? I think some of that got fleshed out here. How many are trained every year? And we'll talk about that. How many stay in the profession? How many drop out? Are there opportunities to turn their training into a profession in Jamaica? And I'm glad we've got JNHT representatives here, because Jamaica is blessed in the sense it's got a large agency that deals directly with the archaeology of the island itself. And Rosie, I will say, as the lecturer in archaeology, I've taught classes to over 10 students. That's been great. That's a bigger class for me. And my former student John, who is on the executive board of the ASJ, can speak to this. I've taught classes to a single student for an entire semester. So our numbers really aren't that large, which, in my background in archaeology, that often provided more hands-on experience, more opportunities to get out in the field, to work in the lab. But it definitely is undersubscribed. And I don't want to pick on anyone, but my boss is in the room, I think, Dr. Enrique Okembe, who's the head of the Department of History and Archaeology. And he is, for the last couple of years of him at the helm, he's been incredibly passionate and honest about addressing the lack of numbers, whether it's in archaeology, history, heritage studies alone. So, Enrique, I'm sorry to put you on the spot here, but do you have any wisdom to impart in relation to that question?
Hi, Zach, and hello, everybody. First, I apologize for joining late. This is the things that comes with head of department. I think I started to do like what I always accuse some of my students, not reading things properly. I saw a 1 and I thought it was like it starts at 1 p.m. So I never saw the 11. So sorry about that. This has been recorded, so hopefully I'll be able to catch up. Yes, wisdom regarding increasing. I think it's more, the more I think about it is to changing the perception of, and especially younger generations' relationship with the past. I think that's what we need to work on, and I think that starts from a young age. I think I'm thinking of the, I'm thinking of like when they are at the primary school level. Forgive me, I'm being a bit rude. Let me turn on the. Oh, anyway, wrong camera again. So sorry about that. Yes. Anyway, let me turn it off. It's giving trouble. So I was just saying that it starts with the young age, and I think the relationship with the past, and I think it's that's what we need to work on. We have had many discussions as to how we can change perceptions. These perceptions have been around for a long time. They have taken a long time to solidify the way they are, but I think there is room. I think if we start, presenting issues, and I think archaeology can do. I think is a fantastic opportunity to change that relationship with the past. When we talk about history, they tend to see it more at a theoretical level, but archaeology and the material culture is something that I think can be the kids and children can be introduced to these things. I think at the end of the day, to have more researchers, local researchers, what we need to have is a bigger pool of students, students at the undergraduate level, whether it is in history or whether it is in archaeology. That bigger pool, it's going to create opportunities for people to to go into research and so on. But definitely, I mean, I have children myself, and I see the opportunities. I look at the books that the social, the issues that they address, and there are significant opportunities there. It's just that we need to discuss that past differently. connections to, they need to see more clearly those connections to their lives and to their present. But I do think that there are significant opportunities if we start engaging, and perhaps this is what I'm trying to get into. This event for today, I wonder the extent to which the society can engage in more kind of activities that also target young students at the primary and secondary school level. I think in that sense, archaeology has an advantage over history. I'm not saying that history cannot do it as well, but I think the archaeology presents that opportunity. And in some cases, if archaeology opens the gate for more people becoming interested in archaeology, or some becoming interested in history, I think that will be fantastic. But I think events like these that we're using now, these webinars or these online formats, and when we resume face-to-face contact, I think that the society has to start working on with primary and secondary school children, and bring the academics and the researchers into those spaces, separate and apart from the formalities of having to learn the knowledge that they need to sort of repeat or regurgitate in the exams. We have to do it for the fun of it, and I think that's what I will encourage the society to do, and hopefully we can start making progress over the next few years. It's going to take a while though.
Yeah, thank you, Enrique. And your mention of exams is stressing me out. I've got to get back to exam marking. It is the season, isn't it? In terms of stats, though, there are trained PhD Jamaican archaeologists. Iva Connelly's names come up, Leslie Gale Atkinson, both of which who focus on the pre-Columbian period, Jamaican First Peoples, but who also are engaged in a variety of other projects. Dr. Kadeen Harris was in the room, and Jillian mentioned her involvement at UE as a product of UE Mona, as a collaborator on campus digs. I'm not sure if she was at Stuart Castle. She's currently at Kenyon and has completed a dissertation on plantation site in the island of Dominica. And no doubt, I may be not considering others, but there is a gap between what you do at undergraduate, what degrees are available in Jamaica at the master's level, and currently we're redesigning, and we offer a heritage studies, but with one archaeologist currently at UE, quite difficult to outline an MA PhD specific to archaeology. But let's get a bigger team together, and most certainly that's a possibility. So thank you, Rosie, for your insights and your contributions, your questions. We had another issue, and this, Hayden, this is coming out on Facebook, and it says you used a Mexican architect to reconstruct a replica of an enslaved, kidnapped people's house on Jamaica. I don't think you were involved with that reconstruction, but I think it's a good point. That's a bit daunting, if I may respectfully suggest. What about architects in and around the community of Falmouth? As a Jamaican archaeologist, it seems like Dorothy was previously employed at the Jamaican National Heritage Trust. We always try to utilize our local sources in our archaeological reconstruction work to garner and foster pride and to set an educational framework for the community. This is quite pivotal to bolster the effort for the community to collaborate with cultural agencies to preserve and protect the built and hidden heritage. Hayden, can you offer any insights? I know you wouldn't have been in charge for reconstructions, but
I think that might have been whoever sent that along might be, maybe I didn't communicate this effectively, but the architect who did the reconstructive illustrations is Kevon. He's practicing in New Mexico, but he is Jamaican, and I think Dorothy, that's what they did.
Dorothy.
So yeah, this was a collaboration with a Jamaican architect.
All right, Hayden, I totally overlooked that. I remember you mentioned that. So Dorothy, I hope that's clear in your mind. Just a Jamaican architectural historian. Kevon's got that archaeological passion as well. He's currently working, trained working in New Mexico. So no Mexican architect, it's a Jamaican architect. Rich, we got a question, and it's about the blue ceramics that you showed on your slide. Was that Delftware?
Some of it is, we didn't have too much delftware. A lot of it's,
Good question.
a lot of it is white salt glazed stoneware with sort of a cobalt blue decoration on it. And then we have some later pearlwares as well that are blue. I think all of those showed up in the image. Very little delft or tin glazed, except for a fragment of an ointment pot. Our deposits are a little bit late for delft.
And I should say, in terms of just artifact assemblage-based question, Sean, I think on his slide showed the fragment of the red clay tobacco pipe. I know you found one of those as well, right? So lack of coarse earthenware cooking vessels, but seemingly evidence of informal production, likely among enslaved African peoples at Orange Valley, at Stuart Castle. Beyond coarse earthenware ceramics, you also have these other instances. And anyone interested in red clay tobacco pipes, in the archaeology lab, James Lee, who was the founder of the Archaeological Society of Jamaica, there was a construction project, I think, in Alligator Pond. We've got a tremendous collection that was, I mean, it was surface collections, but large amount of tobacco pipes, including both white kaolin clay and the local red clay tobacco pipes. Sean mentioned his having the example they recovered there, having a maker's mark. I don't think I've seen any with maker's mark, but that's interesting to note. And I think Sean did mention there's a very good study on red clay, Jamaican red clay tobacco pipes, a master's out of the Port Royal project. So anyone interested in red clay or smoking, check it out. Okay. Let's thank you, Rich. We also had a question, but it was answered in the chat. But I don't know, Rich, if you wanted to talk any more about who owns Orange Valley now, Henderson family. There was a comment after that. Hopefully there's a museum there and a monument. I think you may have made a response there, but how about you tell us a bit more about what has happened or potentially future plans at the site?
Sure, yeah, I could speak to that. Also, just to go back to those red clay pipes for a minute, that's completely fascinating because it speaks to local production. And we also had, and I think you saw it in one of the images, we also had a locally produced bead, an earthenware bead with this great stipple decoration. It was one of the most intriguing finds we had, and presumably it was locally produced as well. In terms of our artifact collections, or the artifact collections from Orange Valley, we do all our processing while we are in Jamaica, so everything gets washed and cataloged while we're there, and we keep all the artifacts in Jamaica on the estate, on the Orange Valley estate. So nothing's ever taken out of the country. I'm just frankly afraid to do that and to lose something or God forbid not be able to get it back. So everything is housed on site with copies of the report so that somebody could open the boxes and have the catalog right there. They have a small, again, they're not really on the tourist trail, but they do have a small museum on site. And they have displayed some of the archaeological finds that the Henderson family found particularly intriguing. They also have other artifacts that have, you know, you can imagine a several 100-acre estate. Things just kick up, so they have other things on display there, as well as a lot of equestrian memorabilia, because really since the 1950s, that's been the main focus of that estate. I think their hope is, you know, if the economy improves and COVID recedes, to invite more folks out to see the ruins, to see these collections. So it's a great question. I also saw a question about.
Yeah. Sorry, Rich,
I also saw the question about the use of the word slaved and enslaved, and that's something I've tried to be conscious of and tried to use enslaved as opposed to the term slave.
Yeah, I saw that question raised, and thank you, Miranda, for all the good questions you're offering. I think, like historians, archaeologists, unless perhaps they're reading from documents or you know, a map, that trend, and rightfully so, has been adopted as well within the field of historical archaeology. So if you heard that, I'm not sure where that would have popped up. Miranda, are you on the line? I'm sorry, I was hearing someone on the line. I didn't want to.
That was me,
anyone.
Jillian.
Oh, Jillian, go ahead.
Yeah, I
Yes.
wanted to actually chime in though about, and Suzanne
Yes.
I see is raising her hand. I don't know if you can unmute yourself, Suzanne, or do you need Zach to do that?
Nope, she's good.
Okay, cool.
No, I can after you're finished.
I just wanted to chime in about the coarse earthenwares, the locally produced coarse earthenwares, and to send people once again to the DAX live stream. Fraser has a great talk on there looking at coarse earthenware production on Jamaica and Nevis and St. Kitts. We did a large scale laser ablation and neutron activation analysis of those ware types. And it's really looking like on Jamaica for the hundreds of sherds we sampled, it's specialized production as opposed to individual household production. And I would guess that probably the same thing's happening with the pipes. There's probably a few specialists, sort of workshops on the island. Not to say there isn't some household production going on and that somebody might not be making pinch pots or little individual clay beads like the one you found, Rich. That definitely sounds like that's made right on site. But certainly it'd be great to get some of those locally produced pipes out for compositional analysis to see how it fits in with what's happening with coarse earthenware production. So
I just wanted, there are a couple of things. One relates to the talk of the archaeologists and the young archaeologists. And I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind is the population of the country and the region and the job opportunities that are there. And I think one of the great things, just looking at some of the names on today, many of them are young history and archaeology students and young members of the Archaeological Society of Jamaica. And it's great to see them here for the length of the presentations. And hopefully they will be able to pull on much of what has been said in their own thinking about what research they may want to do should they get those opportunities. So that's one of the things that I wanted to mention. The second thing relates to the conversation of history and archaeology, which Jillian knows is something that I'm absolutely passionate about, just the increased value that comes, and Rich talked about it in terms of their access to that material at Orange Valley, and I'm sure that it's something that everybody has, but I think that the deliberate enhanced conversation is so important. And Enrique, when you're talking about the possibilities for UE, I keep thinking about one of the periods between 2007 and 2011 when we were doing work on Papine and Mona. And it was around the time when research days were going on. And I kept thinking that how great would it have been had students literally been funneled out into the field where we were digging. Mark you, some of the pits that we were digging at that point were not really, giving. They were very hard. They were under what is now a football field at Papine in the area behind the Halls of Residence. So it may not have been the very best example of how interesting it is. But I really do think that that kind of engagement of persons in school really can help to make a difference to how people respond to the past and to the exploration of the past and the bringing of fragments of historical data together with the archaeology, which is something that Jillian and I have worked on both in terms of Papine and Mona, but are now looking at in terms, I saw on her slide, Roslyn Estate, which is another one that we've been able to come up with some material that we really want to try and make those connections. I think it's so important and it offers so much. So I just really wanted to kind of make that pitch. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Suzanne. Oh, Jillian, go ahead.
I will jump on Suzanne's too. And when I'm done, I might call out Clive Gray to talk a little bit maybe about his experience having been an undergraduate at UE, now being the UE laboratory technician, and really been drawn into archaeological projects of all types across the island, as well as coming to work with us at DAX in Virginia on a couple of occasions. But sort of bouncing off of Suzanne and addressing Miranda, you know, Suzanne and I together as a team are working really hard to try, as you said, to read against the grain of the archival records, and to both pair, you know, what we know about individuals over time and space with what we see from the material record, with the material record offering a real check on those documents, and a real way to try to understand what these material patterns that were left by enslaved men, women, and children, you know, mean when you bounce it up against 5 inventories, if you're lucky, you know, maybe you have 1 inventory and a plat, you know, you might have a plat that has nothing on it. But, you know, more broadly, the documentation that deals with enslavement, primary source material that talks about slavery, even on a more general basis, provides in some ways this sort of contextual paradigm for which you can sort of set up frameworks to test archaeologically then, right? You know, so are what people saying is happening with amelioration really, how is that playing out on the ground? What do we see?
Thank you, Jillian. And Clive, I don't know if you're hearing and have a functional mic, but perhaps you could shed some light on going from, you know, the trenches with Dax to now what behind the, you know, in charge of the collections and security and managing active field work. I want to give you the opportunity to speak to that, if your technology is sound. You good to go? Give me a sign, Clive, or send a message in the chat. I do, and I'll give you a moment here. Again, from Dorothy on Facebook. Thank you for the engagement, Dorothy. Your next question, though, archaeologists and the group that's on the panel right here, they're mandated, and you used to work at the JNHT. They're mandated to leave their research publications or provide a research publication along with a sense of where their collections are. I'm hearing a lot of feedback. I'm sorry, y'all. To the JNHT itself. So those records are available. Some of those collections may be available there. Or as you've heard today, if they're private landowners, private property, those collections are generally kept on site. But the permitting process through the JNHT requires, its collaboration and knowledge sharing is built into the permitting process. I sit on the JNHT board and am quite proud that they have that responsibility when it comes to not only paying your money to dig in the ground, but also leaving the products of this information. So Dorothy, I hope that gets to your comment. And yeah, Clive, that's where I'm at there. And Clive, I think I'm seeing your hand up now. You've got some feedback though, bud.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
That's Clive. It's all right. If you're going through the technical issues, we'd love to hear your opinion though.
Okay. So yes,
I'm sorry, Clive. It's not gonna work. I think from your phone there's some issues.
Okay. All right.
It's kind of sounding like that movie Poltergeist right now, that horror movie. So let's, Clive, perhaps in the chat, you can provide some insights. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Well, I'll blame Jillian. Jillian put you on the spot. But
Take the blame.
Yeah,
sorry, Clive. I owe you.
If you can resolve that technical issue, we'd love to hear your perspective, Clive. And just and I know this has been going back and forth in the chat, but wanted to air out this question from Miranda. I've been thinking about the importance of reading. Well, I think Jillian raised the issue of reading against the grain. Perhaps other archaeologists on the panel can speak to this. How do archaeologists deal with issues in order to avoid replicating the worldview of white enslavers who wrote those documents? For example, it's easy to be impressed by a pretty hospital building, but were enslavers just investing in their property after the abolition of the traffic in enslaved Africans? meant it was much harder to replace them. Also, Miranda was a little concerned that the drawings Hayden showed seemed to prettify the plantation almost like the landscape paintings of the time. Example, the cat, was it a pet? I hope so. Or had it been a malnourished person's dinner, which most certainly could have been the case. Any panelists, and Hayden, I know you've responded to this in the chat. Any other panelists, and Jillian, you've actually talked about reading against the grain. Any other thoughts, though, from panelists, please?
I think just to jump in, Zach, I think that's an important part of what we're doing here, trying to do here. And the point about the hospital, it's really a good one, right? You look at that building, and it's an impressive piece of architecture even today. But the question then becomes, you know, who are the folks who built that building? Who are they actually talking to, especially with that Latin inscription up there? I don't think they're speaking to the enslaved population at all. I think they're speaking to their neighbors on other plantations, and they're making a very conscious statement. They're probably also speaking to abolitionists in Great Britain and in the United States and throughout the Caribbean. And in the archaeology, I like to see the archaeology is giving voice to the folks who are otherwise not part of the narrative that building sort of naturally presents. And Miranda's other point is really well taken, and it's reflected by the documentary record for Orange Valley. It's pretty clear that one of the reasons the hospital was built, it's not really about largesse at all. It's in order to make sure that there is a population of enslaved people, horrible as that is, who can continue to work on this estate in the period of amelioration. So I think the questions are really smart, but they actually speak to exactly what we're trying to do with the archaeology, and that's to reveal kind of the rest of the story instead of just saying like, wow, that's a Georgian building that's completely over the top. Who would have thought it'd be out here? Say, but why is it out here? What is going on? And there's a lot more to it. And it's actually you think of hospitals, typically I think we think of hospitals in a positive light, but this really complicates the story, and the archaeology complicates that as well.
Hey, Hayden, you want to talk about,
Yeah,
Jillian, do you mind, Hayden, those illustrations? I see your comment here, and I think that would be good to talk about, but then yeah. Jillian, right to you.
All right, so yeah, to the question about, you know, do these illustrations, you know, are they prettifying, you know, the past? And so that's an excellent question, and actually a question that we explicitly dealt with in the process of creating these illustrations. So Zach, if I may, I'm just going to put up one of those illustrations just to as an example of this. So if everyone can see this is one illustration where we wanted to deal explicitly with this question of, are we prettifying the past? And so in this one, Kevon and I worked together to show not only the domestic side of you know, enslaved life at Good Hope, but we wanted to show the labor side of enslaved life at Good Hope and how these roads fit in with the village, because the roads really help tell the story of disrupting this otherwise, you know, pretty picture of the past, because these little egress and ingress points on the roads really show that how they were used as, you know, these are the funneling mechanisms through which people were distributed throughout the plantation and broken up into task groups every day and put under these harsh labor conditions. And as you can see, that's everyone from adults to enslaved children. We have records for Good Hope that really document children working in the fields as early as age 6. So that's something we wanted to confront directly in these illustrations. So.
Hayden, thank you. Jillian, sorry.
Yeah. Just actually quickly, I wanted to talk or sort of chime in a little bit about the hospitals. But first, I see that Pauline has asked twice, are there evidence for sugar estates that are in the same location as earlier Spanish sugar plantations? And Seville Estate is sort of the prime example on Jamaica, where you've got a 17th century to early, 17th century to early 18th century Spanish sugar estate that Robert Woodard's been doing for life's work on, and then further up the hill, the later 18th century sugar estate, English sugar estate is. I'm sure there are others, but Seville's the one that comes to mind. If any of you have other sites, you might want to let Pauline know in the chat as well. But Rich, thinking about hospitals too, and Miranda's comment, it is certainly this very interesting thing that they're put up as a sort of display, as this very costly showpiece across the island as sort of a sign of saying, look, I'm being benevolent, I'm taking care of my enslaved laborers. Your read that, yes, that's the case, but also that this is really about trying to keep enslaved people alive in the face of the abolition of the slave trade. But the reality is that, that natural increase, deaths were just, the death rate plummeted, right? I mean, the death rate, I should say, increased. Natural increase plummeted through the 19th century until emancipation, at which point, even then it was very hard for formerly enslaved to reproduce at a level in which they were actually having positive population increase. And so these hospitals weren't doing their job. And I think that's a really, that's a fascinating angle to also try to tackle archaeologically, is to sort of look at them and say, what are the questions that the material, how can the material culture address exactly how horrible hospitals were as well? That people were still dying in these horrible numbers. And, did hospitals make a dent on these estates? It would be fascinating to know. Hard to know. You'd have to have great ledgers. I see Suzanne wanting to chime in too. Oh,
no, I was just thinking that Rich had mentioned this ocular window, which in a sense helped to ensure that persons could be confined. And I saw Hayden put something in the chat about the sort of confinement aspect, the penitentiary aspect that hospitals may have or did play. So I just thought that was an interesting addition.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you all for your comments. We're gonna wrap up now, and thank you all so much for your attendance. We did have some good comments from Prof. Vereen Shepard, who had to leave early, so I think this will be the last. It's a question, it's a comment. I think we've gotten some of the applications of archaeology in the contemporary, in Jamaican contemporary society out, but for Prof, and I know where this question is coming from, and it's a great question. I respect it. Do archaeologists lobby for contemporary action based on their findings? After the excavations, the theses, the publications, the databases, conference papers, then what? What is the applied aspect of archaeology? And especially coming from Prof, leading efforts with the Center of Reparation Research at our campus, I think that's a really good question, and one perhaps we can all think about, but I want to throw that out to our panelists. And I think this is also a good place for us to end our conversation today, which we've already gone over 48 minutes past the hour. It's good when it does that. So what do you all think? Applied archaeology in Jamaica, the Caribbean.
I'll just start with just, at least from the perspective from Good Hope, was that our version of applied archaeology was twofold, and it was kind of two things I've already mentioned. I'll just reiterate. One was contributing to the professionalization of the field by creating these paid opportunities every season for both at the crew chief and field technician level. But two, what happens to the data, all the information afterwards? For us, at least, it was really about reconceptualizing our representation of the past in Jamaica. Right now, it's very much focused on the planter elite by their design. That's what remains from the preservation of this period. And so it is our job as archaeologists to take the information that we're finding from these village contexts and, you know, put out a new image of what the past in Jamaica was like.
Thank you, Hayden. Any others? And again, I think the training aspect, I mean, you saw that with Hayden, Jillian really underscored that. Rich, your photos really underscored that. So any final thoughts from you all?
Well, you know, I think this is a subject for another 3-hour panel, and one in which Suzanne should be on, because she's worked very, very hard over the years to bring, as I think most of us on this call know, you know, to bring the archaeological record to the public through public monuments. She made an amazing attempt to actually, you know, memorialize and exhibit buildings and artifacts at the Pepin village that we hope maybe one day will be successful. You know, we'll actually make it through all the political hurdles. But, you know, it's a combination of money and politics at all levels for thinking about training, thinking about jobs after training, and then thinking about how one gets the archaeological information out there through exhibits and displays. And DAX, you know, we really focus on training and making sure all the data are accessible, freely accessible to anybody who wants to access them and use them in whatever way they'd like. We don't put any constraints on that.
And I would just sort of build on what Jillian was saying, and that I think as archaeologists doing this work, we hope to be allies to folks working for or working towards issues of social justice today. And one of the things that's been really gratifying in terms of my work with Nikki Kelly and others from Monmouth in Jamaica has been that it seems every time we go, we get some students who are part of, I guess what you might call the Jamaican diaspora, who want to participate in our digs. They may not be archaeology students at all. They may be psychology or social work or nursing, but they're of Jamaican descent, and they see this as a critical way to engage with what ultimately is their heritage. So, and that's really an important part of our project.
Sean, I don't know if you've got any closing thoughts regarding that issue. You could go on for a second. You could go on for 20 minutes. We never know at that phase.
No, you can't.
Anyway.
Yeah. Geez, Zach, what are you saying about me here? No, yeah, I full-heartedly agree with everybody's statements already. I think the one other point I'll say is that I do hope that, right, sort of some of this work does foreground for people, even if, you know, they don't want to directly connect to a piece of archaeological evidence, but it foregrounds the notion that sort of, you know, the ways that materials are used, the ways that, you know, sort of social interaction is sort of regulated by the types of things that are operating in our daily lives. I think that is something that, regardless if it's pre-Columbian, if it's historic plantation period, right, that sort of cognizance, I think, is something that is incredibly important for just sort of a social consciousness right now, for any time. But and I think that's one of the values that archaeology brings, regardless of the topic that it's addressing. But, that's my bit.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you all. Thank you to all the contributors. Thank you to our impressive audience. This has been very very valuable. Thank you all for your attention, your contribution, your support, as well as your feedback. Please stay tuned to the Archaeological Society of Jamaica. We've got a new website. We're on social media now, and we are regularly responding to emails. We've got a really good group, and I just, again, I want to finish this up by thanking the group, the executive body of the Archaeological Society of Jamaica, which it includes undergraduate students, retirees, it includes a variety of individuals living in Jamaica right now. So stay tuned to us, because we need your feedback, we need your support for a number of initiatives moving forward, including the planning of future events. So please become a member. It doesn't cost a lot. and that's your direct way that you can support us to make sure that we're best serving Jamaica, the Jamaican government, Jamaican people, and the international community. So thank you all so much for the opportunity to hold this, and we'll see you next time. Oh, thank you, Teresa. I just saw your comment. Oh my goodness, Dr. Teresa Singleton from Syracuse University. I miss you, Teresa.